What is up, wrestling fans, and welcome to the March edition of 2001 A Wrestling Odyssey. And joining me once again on this journey back in time is Robert D. Felice.
Hello, Callum. How are you feeling on this wonderful March of 2001?
Oh, the March of 2001 is a very pivotal month in our trip back in time. And just for purposes of nostalgia, we can also say that we're recording this on the 16th of March. So it's 3/16 Day.
It's Stone Cold Day. How are you celebrating? Aside from this podcast, are you drinking a little beer?
Yeah, just break open a couple of Steve Weisers, stomp a mud hole in someone's ass. That's just the usual stuff.
And you gotta walk it dry, you know.
But I won't be beating my wife, though. I'll draw a line on that.
Good.
Ah, what a great way to start a podcast. With domestic violence, the perfect way to start a show. But this edition is we're going to open it up with, obviously, the biggest piece of news from this month of the year, which is the death of WCW. As we've obviously alluded to in the previous month stuff, WCW was in the process of being sold, but it was obviously the idea was they would continue as its own as a promotion under the guidance of Eric Bischoff and Fusion Media, because they were the people that seemed most interested in purchasing it. But over the course of this month, that vision changed into WCW going out of business completely and falling under the ownership of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation. So, Rob, you were obviously watching at the time, whereas I came into wrestling a little bit later than that. Do you have any memories of the day that WWF purchased WCW?
I have a memory of my older brother going on to the internet and finding out that WWF had bought WCW and tune into Nitro because it is now the last episode of WCW ever. And then I have real vivid memories of the last Nitro, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Okay, so essentially, for many people, this is considered the darkest day in professional wrestling's history. Outside of, you have the human tragedies like Owen Hart's death, the Chris Benoit tragedy, career-ending injuries, stuff along those lines. But in terms of just something that impacted the business, I don't think anything really shook the wrestling industry to its core. The only thing prior to this would have been Vince McMahon's slow consolidation of the wrestling business by taking the biggest stars from all of the local promotions.
Yeah, I mean, and this is still very much in that same vein. It's Vince McMahon once again owning this monopoly over wrestling, or even more of a monopoly than before, because even if you didn't like WCW or ECW, that was still somewhere to go and work, or for fans, somewhere to watch as an alternative.
Yeah, and a lot of people seem to believe that as WCW got worse, more fans actually came to WWF, when it's in fact not really the case. It was the idea of, as both promotions were doing so well and the competition between the pair of them, it would build up both their audiences organically. They would attract more fans that weren't previously watching. So as WCW started to decline, it wasn't like WWF's numbers rose and rose and rose. Obviously, there would be some crossover, and obviously there were people, I assume you included, would watch both shows.
Yes.
But there were some that only watched WCW and some that only watched WWF. And so as WCW's ratings went down, WWF's ratings didn't increase dramatically, and it just meant that less people were watching wrestling. And as we found out in the years following the WWF's purchase of WCW, it would just be a steady decline in the popularity of wrestling overall.
I think a lot of people, even though we hear that narrative over and over again, don't understand. There was a WWF audience and a WCW audience. There was the crossover there, but it's not like today where, well, I'm a wrestling fan and I want to watch everything. People were very dedicated to their brand, and when WCW went down, a lot of people, especially those who liked that southern wrestling take on wrestling, really did fall off.
Alright, so why don't we start from the beginning of what was happening in March? Because essentially from the start of March, there was still the firm belief that WCW would be purchased by Eric Bischoff and Fusion Media, but there were a few snags along the way. Obviously, in our January edition, which you can obviously go back and listen to, as well as the February one, we mentioned that Eric Bischoff and Fusion Media had already sent out a press release saying that they'd purchased the company, which wasn't actually the case. They were just trying to capitalise off the back of AOL's merger with Time Warner. In the actual, like, going along the lines of into March, it became pretty obvious that Fusion had a lot of difficulties with the deal, in the sense of they were worried about the price. At this point in time, it was estimated that WCW was losing between $5 million and $7 million a month, which is obviously a big pill to swallow for a company that's trying to purchase them. And it led to Fusion Media deducting their initial offer of around $70 million to closer to 40 or 50 million. It's still a significant amount of money, especially when we go further along and find out how much WCW actually was sold for. But would you kind of understand the idea of a company that's losing that amount of money having difficulties being sold?
I would, because, an investment, when you get into an investment, you don't want to necessarily have to be the lifesaver. You just kind of want to invest some money and see if you can help it grow. You don't want to necessarily resuscitate a dying brand, which is what they might have had to have done.
Yeah, absolutely, especially because these were people, obviously Bischoff had the background in wrestling, but the rest of the people would just be television executives. You can't really suggest that they would know everything about the wrestling industry or a willingness to take part of it if they knew they couldn't turn a profit on it, which is kind of the issue that relates to the reasons why WCW went down. Because we'll obviously talk about later on the people that may or may not have been blamed for this collapse of WCW in the long run, but it really boils down to a man called Jamie Kellner. Are you familiar with this man?
Only from the little bits that I've heard through the recent 83 Weeks podcast.
Okay, so Jamie Kellner, just a quick background. He was obviously had a long career in television. He's kind of the seen as the driving force behind Fox Kids and the WB networks, so Warner Brothers networks. He was also seen to be like somebody who was quite firmly behind programs directed towards teenage girls or young women as well. So I think some of the shows that he's kind of credited with working with were Seventh Heaven, Dawson's Creek, Gilmore Girls, that kind of thing. So
very early 2000s, must-see TV for the MTV generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, well, just as a spoiler alert, wrestling does not fall under his, the kind of programming that he enjoyed. And essentially, during March, he became the CEO of Turner. And even though people might think that I'm exaggerating, but this is actually the case, that one of his first directives as CEO was to cancel Nitro and Thunder and say that no wrestling will take place on any Turner-related broadcasts. So that was it.
Why do you think people have such a hard-on for wrestling like that sometimes? There are people who just will never get it, don't get it, and have this vendetta against people who find wrestling as a form of entertainment.
I think, especially at this point in time, wrestling was considered a dirty word because of what the WWF was doing. And it's the ideas about the Attitude Era, the sleaziness surrounding it, the increased levels of violence, the blood, the scantily clad women, stuff along those sort of lines. I think there was just an essential perspective that WWF and pro wrestling in general appealed to the lowest common denominator. And especially for Kellner and people surrounded with Turner, they wanted to, I guess, increase the prestige of their networks. And so being associated with a wrestling product was a sign that they weren't a prestigious network. It was a sign that they appealed to not so much the masses, but appealed to rednecks, drunkards, that sort of thing. Whether we agree with that or not, but you have to say that, especially with the sort of programming that Raw was putting out at that point in time, and the people that turned up to these shows, they could have been understood to have that sort of opinion of it.
Yeah, I don't like to admit, what professional wrestling fans tend to bring to the table, but yeah, you can't argue with the truth.
So in March, reasonably early in March, I think it was towards like the first couple of weeks, Jim Weiss, a Turner spokesperson, released the following statement. WCW is not a core business for Turner Broadcasting. We've decided that professional wrestling in its current incarnation just isn't appropriate for the high-scale, upscale brand that we have built on TNT and TBS Superstation. We're no longer interested in carrying the product.
Now, I know you said you weren't watching, but are you aware of what it was being shown on your region of the world?
I believe WCW was actually on terrestrial television, as opposed to WWF, which was linked immediately to Sky, which is essentially a paid-for subscription service, especially at that point in time. So WCW was actually more accessible to people because that was through a television station that people would get automatically when they have a television set. I can't remember which show it was particularly, but I don't know whether it had already been cancelled in the UK by this point in time. I assume not, but I can't say for certain what terrestrial channel was on, but I know it was on a more easily accessible television station than Raw or SmackDown was. Okay, so I get a lot of information for just as a credit to people who I'm helping, because we're obviously just regurgitating history at this point in time for people that may not be familiar or want to get our opinions on what happened to this. I take a lot of inspiration from the book Death of WCW by Brian Alvarez and R.D. Reynolds. That's got most of the information out of this thing, because I just think that, and there's also other books in existence about WCW's past in which it gives you a lot more in-depth thing. Like, we're only going to scratch the surface really in our discussion. So if you want to find out more, that they're kind of like huge waves of information out there. So this is just encouragement to do other people to do further research. But essentially, once Kellner decided that Nitro and Thunder would no longer be featuring on network television, and that was from the end of March. Obviously, the final broadcast of Nitro was on March 26th. Then for Fusion Media, there was no interest in the deal anymore, because without television, that company was worth nothing.
I believe they also said that they wouldn't give you. Bischoff has said in interviews they weren't going to give him the library either. They were just going to give him like whatever rings and actual wrestling paraphernalia that they owned.
There's obviously the potential of that sort of thing, but at least with television, they would be able to build the brand up like further and do more stuff with it. But it's just the idea that without television, you couldn't build towards pay-per-views, you couldn't make money. So without TV, they only had a brand and a tape library, and when obviously the internet was developing, but still in its infancy at that point in time, there's no concept of streaming or WWE Network or anything along those lines. The tape library is pretty much useless, other than to sell videos or DVDs.
Right, but I'm saying I think a media company would have at least maybe put a bid in for the library, but when they said we're only going to give you the wrestling stuff, what business would Fusion Media want at that point as a media company?
Yeah, that is true. I think essentially the long-standing belief, or at least the idea surrounding it, is that once the television was off the market, the only person that could potentially be interested in WCW would be Vince McMahon, because he was the only person that had any sort of level of competition, especially with ECW on its way out. Actually, that's quite an interesting thing in the sense that even though we've kind of stopped talking about ECW at this point in time because they had their last show in the start of January and have had absolutely nothing on the radar since. But ECW didn't die until the first week of April. So ECW actually outlasted WCW, which is quite funny.
That is pretty funny.
So essentially, what was going to happen is as soon as they were taken off television, obviously Fusion Media pull out. There's still other interested parties outside of WWF, but it seems pretty obvious that it's going to be WWF that snap them up. Do you want to know, considering Fusion Media was offering in the region of 40 or 50 million when the TV deal was still alive, what essentially their final offer from Fusion was $5.7 million up front and then $2.15 million a year for the next 20 years. So they'd still actually be paying it if they had actually got the deal through, like today. But how much do you think that Vince McMahon, knowing those figures, actually purchased WCW for?
500, about $500,000. How about that?
Oh, you're underselling it a little bit there, but it's good that you went under rather than over.
Because I know it's a very low number. Is it at least beyond $1 million?
Oh yeah, it's beyond $1 million. Okay. They eventually sold to Vince McMahon for the trademark and logo sold for $2.5 million, and then they sold the tape library for a further $1.7 million.
I would guarantee you that Vince McMahon was more interested in that tape library than he was the brand and the logo. Because didn't they go and immediately change the logo?
Yeah, I believe so, because I think WCW was still running with that weird one with the two small W's and the giant C in the middle.
Which, here's an honest story. I didn't get until like a year ago that was actually two W's and a C. I just thought it was some weird shape. Not my favorite logo, suffice to say.
No, that was the one that Bischoff decided to introduce in '99 that would save the company, as he apparently coined at that point in time. But it took more than a logo, let's put it that way. So obviously the death of WCW ended this long-standing association with, it was stretching back to 1931. So that's when Jim Crockett Promotions is kind of said to have started. So essentially this is a company that had 70 years of existence put into it, far longer than the WWF had, which I think stretches back to the late 50s, early 60s. So this was one of the world's oldest wrestling promotions, and it was just gone in a flash because of the television executive snapping his fingers and saying that it was gone. How does that make you as a wrestling fan feel that it was essentially the television industry's unwillingness to associate itself with professional wrestling that led to its demise in general?
Being older and seeing that so many more times throughout my life, it doesn't surprise me, but yeah, it really is a slap in the face. It's one of those things, I always equate it to, there's a good Mick Foley promo from ECW where he said, professional wrestling will never be respected, no matter how many teeth I lose, no matter how many ears I lose, no matter how many brain cells have to die. And I think, to a certain extent, that has proven itself to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does have the stigma attached to it, but like I say, at this point in time, Vince McMahon was kind of living up to that stigma, even though he would try and defend it as much as he possibly could, of saying we're wholesome family entertainment. It really wasn't at this point in time, and it's sad in the sense that this is the time when wrestling's at its most popular, and whether you can crap on the creativity of the current product, it's in a far more, I don't want to say sophisticated state, but it's far more inclusive. It's gone a lot further away from the old style of the Attitude Era, and yet it's far less popular.
I don't think you can make an argument that today's wrestling is much more highbrow. This is something I would want to show, younger children. You can show young girls the women's revolution today. I wouldn't want to show young girls, Major Guns and Stacy Keibler and Trish Stratus. No offense to them whatsoever, but they weren't presenting role model characters.
Okay, so there was one final hope for Bischoff before WCW was eventually sold to the WWF, the deal was actually completed, or at least announced by the WWF on the 23rd of March. And that was just a couple of weeks after Kellner's announcement that they were going to get rid of WCW from television. So essentially he wanted to try and sell it to Fox, because Fox had shown some sort of vague interest in holding a wrestling promotion. Apparently Hulk Hogan had tried pitching ideas to them as well about opening his own wrestling promotion in there, which wouldn't really be his own promotion. It would be an extension of WCW, and that would lead to a territory war between Hogan's promotion and WCW, and it would eventually lead to all of them working together. You know how it is. But that was just a rumor at that point in time. It's quite funny that prior to, like, I think it was just a year earlier, maybe sometime in 2000, SFX had shown an interest in purchasing WCW as well, and they were offering somewhere in the region of between $500 and $600 million.
That's a number that you just should have taken.
But at that point in time, WCW was run by Ted Turner, and Ted Turner always thought that wrestling would always be part of his shows. But as soon as the AOL Time Warner merger happens, he loses pretty much all power, just becomes the figurehead, and so WCW has to bow down and become financially responsible. And if it can't, then it would be got rid of.
Is he one of the only, if not the only, major mogul that saw the benefit of professional wrestling?
I mean, I can't say that. You can probably say in terms of mogul, maybe. I mean, I'm sure there were many others that were wrestling fans, but clearly they didn't see the willingness to invest into it, especially with Ted Turner in charge of it, because Ted would always wanted to have a wrestling company and wanted to be in the wrestling business, and it meant for other business owners they'd have to tangle with Vince McMahon. Whether they wanted to or not, I guess there was some sort of reluctance there because of the monopoly that Vince hadn't actually established at this point in time, but the dominance that he'd shown over WCW in the last couple of years, there might have been some nervousness associated with it.
Just gonna throw this out there. If in 2002 somebody with Donald Trump money had started his own wrestling or his own television company, I think wrestling would have gone on a Trump network.
So many of the wrestlers who were working with WCW didn't believe that the company was being sold or being closed down until pretty much the final day, because WCW had a long-term history of working the boys, from the executive position down. So, do you remember the instance of the Ric Flair heart attack?
Yep.
Yeah, so essentially that was played off as real, because they tell stories, backstage stories of Charles Robinson breaking down in tears, behind the scenes, because he thought that Ric Flair was actually dying. And they'd played that off like that because essentially they hadn't told anyone that was part of the story, and that this had just happened randomly. So people didn't trust the upper executives. So when they said, "Oh, WCW is closing down on March 26th," they just said, "Oh, okay, they're just messing around. I guess the deal's probably taking a bit longer to get sorted," things along those lines. That's such a crappy way of treating your employees.
Yeah, that's awful.
It's gone to the point where your employees just don't believe a single word you're saying, and the company's going to die, and they won't believe what you're saying, and they're going to be out of a job, and they won't believe what you're saying because of how poorly you've treated them in the past. Yeah, it's just a shock to the system for them, really.
I really feel like, and let's be clear, TNA in today's day and age has dropped greatly in significance. However, I really think that working for TNA must have the same stigma. Yeah, they're closing down. How often have they been told at this point that they're closing down? That when it actually happens, they're probably not even going to believe it.
Yeah, it's yeah, I'm sure now they'll probably believe it because of the position they're in. They must feel like the call's coming. I would say any day now, but maybe in the next few months when their television program is being broadcast to probably less people than watched the Women's Wrestling Unleashed pay-per-view. But
that brings up an interesting point. Do you think that an early internet Like, let's say if you streamed it on an AOL type of thing, do you think WCW could have survived that way?
Well, that was one of the suggestions that Shane McMahon had for it when he would have been taking over for it. Because when people talk about the purchase of WCW and the way that WWF were doing it, and obviously we're going to talk about that in greater detail, the idea was initially to at least to have Shane McMahon as the promoter of it. Obviously, they go through the storyline of Shane actually was the one that purchased WCW, even though it was obviously Vince and WWF related people. But they were actually going to run with the idea of when we put WCW back on television, it will be Shane McMahon as the promoter, and he will promote it himself. Vince will obviously oversee certain aspects of it, but it will be Shane. In the same way that it was the idea of Shane owning owning ECW as well, and running that through a web series. Obviously, the idea was to still have WCW on television because that's when the money was at the time. But it could have survived but maybe it was just too soon. Maybe a few years later, and if this had happened, then it may have been a bit more likely. But I think at this point it was too much in its infancy. You wouldn't be able to run it. Like, streaming wasn't as capable to the point where you'd be able to run these shows through the internet and not come into technical difficulties.
Yeah. Well, it's always fun to think about, seeing as how many businesses, or promotions rather, are thriving in today's landscape.
Yeah, I think we're a lot more fortunate now that people have more platforms and avenues to explore, to build up a fan base and to broadcast it on different networks. Whereas at this point in time, it was just cable television. It's like if you didn't have that, you pretty much couldn't exist, or at least couldn't last long enough to build up a substantial audience. That's why this was seen as such a huge deal, because even though there were independent promotions around, and we'll talk about some going forward that tried to pop up in the wake of WCW's demise, they just couldn't compete with WWF because they had the monopoly over television.
Yeah, and I don't think the business was ready. I don't really. The hype you're seeing with AEW now is just because the business is just getting to a point where it's ready again. It won't feel like, oh, this is just WCW, kind of. The business is finally matured and ready for that new brand.
Are you aware of somebody called Stuart Snider?
Yes, he was also a Turner figurehead, wasn't he?
For a short period of time, but at this point in time, in 2001, he was the WWF president. So he'd previously worked for Turner, and he had joined WWF in 2000 to become the president of the organization. I don't know whether that was an association with them going public at that point in time, becoming a publicly traded company, but essentially he was snatched from Turner, became WWF president, and he was in charge with Brad Siegel, who was in charge of WCW at the time, through an executive position. So there's rumor associated with it. I don't want to drag it through too much because, again, don't want anybody from WWE or WCW's legal team or anything like that. Obviously WCW not anymore, but WWE's legal team listening in and saying oh, he's suggesting that this happened or something along those lines. But it's more there's rumors from WCW employees associated with it that because of the friendship of Stuart Snider and Brad Siegel, that Snider was able to get the deal sorted without any real competition. Because there's been people that have spoken about it recently, including but in the wake of the death, Jerry Jarrett, obviously, who was the person that founded TNA with Jeff Jarrett, said that he was interested in purchasing the company, even if it was just a tape library. There was a WCW executive called Jay Hassman who's also suggested that he wanted to purchase the company. And Randy Savage even said that once he found out how much Vince purchased the tape library for, said that he would have paid twice as much to get that tape library.
Chris Jericho has also said things in the same vein of wow, when I found out how much they actually got it for, I might have put in a bid. I think a wrestling business run by Randy Savage would have been really fun to watch.
It would be quite interesting. I'm sure he would put himself in a pretty prominent position. And that's one non-WWF company that you know that Hulk Hogan would never wrestle for.
Oh, you know, I don't know about that because Randy was very good at walking away. You don't have too many matches of Randy Savage well past his prime like you might a Dusty Rhodes or Hulk Hogan.
No, but I think, well, he would have had a longer run in TNA in 2002, but the idea was that he essentially left because he thought that TNA were close to signing Hulk Hogan.
Hmm.
And that's why he decided to leave. So, I mean, take with that as you will, because Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan had a very on-again, off-again relationship. But I think this was around about the time that Savage was releasing his rap album, which was telling Hulk Hogan to be a man and stuff like that. So
what an amazing piece of history.
Yeah, I'm surprised that didn't win more awards. I wonder if that did any better than some of the WWF anthology albums and stuff like that.
Oh, I'd be willing to bet that it did.
Yeah, so the idea is due to the relationship of Siegel and Snyder, that Brad Siegel essentially has sabotaged any other attempts for people to purchase the company for more money in order to make sure that the deal ended up with Vince McMahon and the WWF, because he was friends with Snyder, even if that meant selling it for less money than other people would pay for it. Which obviously is where you get the libelous side of things, because it will reiterate the fact this is just a rumour, it's never been confirmed, because if this was the case, Brad Siegel could have been arrested and thrown in prison for it, because it's essentially some sort of like blocking of information. So that's why you have to add that caveat to it. It's definitely never been confirmed, but it was quite interesting that when Snyder left WWF in 2001, he went back to work for Turner. So
really?
Yes. So
did he end up doing something for Cartoon Network?
I can't say for certain. I don't really know. I haven't really followed up on his history beyond like the end of his association with WWF. So he might have done, but all we know is that he definitely went back to work for Turner after WWF, and it makes it seem like he may have been brought in as just like a mole almost, or somebody that could keep tabs on WCW if a deal was to eventually become a possibility.
That's what I thought. All right, little bit of Fanboys Anonymous history here. Stu Snider is the man who tried to take cartoons out of Cartoon Network. He's the man who replaced a lot of the stuff that we grew up watching, Callum, like Ed and Eddie and Foster's, and tried to replace it with stuff like Destroy, Build, Destroy, and Out of Jimmy's Head. Are you familiar with those shows?
Oh, I'm totally unfamiliar with those ones.
Very. Suffice to say, this man is credited with trying to kill Cartoon Network. So I'm glad that I have pieced together that he might be the worst figurehead in history, as far as I'm concerned, for the things that he tried to do to brands that I love. Very interesting.
Well, it's nice to have another detestable figure in wrestling. Maybe you should add him to the list of the Fuck That Guy Club nominees.
Oh yeah, actually I'm gonna message Tony about that right now.
Okay, so essentially, we obviously have spoken in the past about the fact that in 2001 it was more likely that this Fusion Media organization was going to be the one who was going to purchase it. WWF had sent out feelers in the past, like in the late 2000s, about purchasing the company when it became pretty obvious that the company was going to be sold. But the main issue surrounding it was Viacom, who essentially were the owners of the TNN, and obviously that was where Raw was being held at that point in time after the move from the USA Network to Spike. They had issues with Vince McMahon essentially running because if they were to purchase WCW at that point in time, it meant that they would still be running it on TNT and TBS because the television networks were still in place at that point in time. And the issue that they had with it is they didn't want to share Vince McMahon's focus between them and a rival network. So that's why there was a big issue with any attempts that WWF previously had in purchasing the company, because they didn't want them working for a different or didn't want Vince or other executives in WWF working for another television program, which I guess makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense to me as well.
And then we can have a look back at and then essentially once the television deals go away, and it's just about purchasing the brand and the tape library, it becomes far easier for WWF to just swoop in and get the deal sorted. It's the more interesting thing of like what they were planning to do with WCW, because Vince was pretty confident. I don't want to say got pretty confident. He wanted to have WCW shows running after Raw and before SmackDown in the week. So essentially, Raw would happen on a Monday, SmackDown would happen on a Thursday. He wanted Nitro to go on Tuesday and Thunder to go on the Wednesday. And I don't know how confident he was, but he seemed like he feels like he could have convinced Viacom to put 2 more wrestling shows in between. Do you think that could have been possible?
Now, I have only heard the rumors that they were going to kick off Raw for Nitro and just make SmackDown the WWF brand, because that was such a, like, that word got in the dictionary because of the WWF. SmackDown is our brand now. I've heard that rumor.
I mean, that came along like further down the line. I'm sure we'll discuss it in the sense, but initially Vince wanted them to have their own shows to compete alongside Raw and SmackDown. Not compete, but be alongside it, so they could start building a rivalry between the two of them, with WCW having its own shows still.
I want to tell you that's crazy just because this isn't a time with the WWE network, but look at what they're doing now. You have at least 5 hours on just regular television, let alone all of the extra hours on the network.
Oh, absolutely. Eventually it started to come down, like towards the end of March, they were reporting that it was more likely that they would get 1 slot for Nitro, but it would be 11 p.m. on Saturday nights. Which,
okay.
So on TNN, I mean, it's something, and if you're a diehard WCW fan, then it might be enough to keep you interested, but it's a pretty deaf slot.
Well, I'll give you the history here, Callum. That's the velocity spot.
Oh, that's
the
what they did with it.
impact spot. Like, yeah, after velocity, that's the impact spot.
Yeah, it is pretty hideous timing, like a 2-hour show that goes on at that point in time, like to 1 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's Saturday night and it's wrestling fans, so I guess they won't have too much interest in, like, they may not be going out as much as other fans would be. But yeah, it's unlikely that was going to have the same impact as other shows. But maybe initially they thought that would be a proof of concept. Like, if they were able to draw people to an 11 p.m. time slot on Saturday nights, maybe eventually they'd be able to parlay that into a better slot.
Like, much like, again, Impact Wrestling, they got on at 11 on Saturdays. They ended up getting into a pretty sweet primetime deal on Thursday nights for a few years there. So it's not unfounded, knowing what we know. It's just crazy to think WCW goes from head-to-head with WWF to 11 p.m. on a Saturday night.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was about to move on to, like, just a comparison about where WCW was just 2 or 3 years earlier. So in 1998, they were attracting over 8,000 fans to each house show. They sold out 49% of all the house shows that went on that year. They took in over $30 million in profits. Compare that to 2000, where they lost $60 million in the entire year. Ratings dominated Raw. They were selling out 30,000 plus arenas. They then averaged 0.93 pay-per-view buy rate, which is close to 1 million buys. And then it was down to a 0.17 in 2000, which is closer to like 100,000 at most, something like that. So it just goes to show how much the decline was in those couple of years.
And I wonder, what is that really attributed to? Is it really the product, or is it a case of the fan base that might have been in their prime just got a little too old for it and outgrew it? You know, that's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, we would like talk about this a little bit later, because we wanted to, obviously, while Jamie Kellner is the executioner, as it were, the one that wielded the axe for WCW, there's a lot of other people that we could cast blame against for WCW's decline, because let's face it, Kellner might have seen wrestling as a a distasteful organisation, but if it had been making money, like good money, at this point in time, he would have kept it because it makes money, and that's really the only determining factor. The fact that maybe it was losing so much money, that was the big issue. The big issue was obviously a mixture of the fact that it was wrestling, and so it had that stigma attached with it. But the bigger issue was the fact that it was losing so much money on a monthly basis. So there has to be a longer term process of who was actually to blame for WCW's demise, because it was a dying brand, and we'll talk about Greed later on. But it was a dying company. This was a company that absolutely in no way resembled the late 90s. In its layout, the people involved, the presentation. The only thing that's really the same is that Tony Schiavone sitting at the announce table.
What a wild ride, because if you really think, I want you to try to put this in today's perspective, the difference between Nitro at its peak in 98 and them closing is the difference between, Roman Reigns versus Triple H and right now. So much happened so quickly.
Okay, so there's a few little caveats associated with this. So the final show, originally they were planning on making it a free to attend event, just so they could get as many people into the door as possible, make it a big spectacle for the final show, give WCW the send off it deserved. And then eventually they decided, close to the time, that they thought, oh fuck it, we'll just sell tickets for it instead. And so the Panama Beach show ends up attracting just over 1,000 people, which is it seems pretty expansive when you see it in there, but it's actually just a few thousand people just well placed, close by. It was a bad decision, let's put it that way, and one final bad decision for WCW to go with.
That really breaks my heart, I gotta tell you.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, they were trying to squeeze as many pennies as they possibly could out of this company. It's just a bad way of doing it. Scott Steiner, once his website actually shut down in the fallout of the WCW thing because of Scott Steiner being angry that he was having to hand over the WCW Championship to Booker T, as we'll talk about when we talk about the final Nitro show, because the belief was that Booker T had already signed with WWF at that point in time, and Scott Steiner hadn't, and so he did it as some sort of protest to being the real champion of WCW still, because he just had to hand the belt over. Can you imagine Scott Steiner doing that?
No. Scotty's a great guy.
So the Wrestling Observer at this point in time reported the following people who had apparently had their contracts acquired by WWF at the time of purchasing WCW, because the contract situation with certain wrestlers is quite an interesting aspect, and something that we'll probably come back to multiple times over the course of the Invasion angle and the rest of 2001. So the following people had been purchased by WWF once purchased by WCW: Lance Storm, Chuck Palumbo, Sean O'Hare, Mark Jindrak, Mike Awesome, Elix Skipper, Shane Helms, Shannon Moore, Stacy Keibler, Chavo Guerrero, Mike Sanders, Hugh Morris, Sean Stasiak, Kaz Hayashi, Young Yang, and Billy Kidman.
So a handful of names there did go on to have a pretty good WWF career. I have to say that I never saw Elix Skipper touch a WWE ring, and Mike Sanders as well. I don't know what happened to him.
Well, essentially, most of these people, some of them went onto WWF television immediately, some of them went to developmental territories because they'd only really started on WCW at this point in time. The reason why these were purchased because they were all on 90-day cycles with their contracts. So essentially, their contracts were being renewed every 90 days. And if WCW wanted to cut them, then they would cut them if they didn't think that they could afford them anymore. So essentially, what happened was WWF cut them from their current deals, and then they had their contracts renegotiated. Which made it a lot more straightforward as a process. Whereas we'll talk about some other people just in a little bit where they were essentially their contracts were with Time Warner and WCW, and so they were being paid significant sums of money by WCW and would be paid those sums of monies guaranteed because of the guaranteed contracts, thanks to good old Kevin Nash. They would be paid that whether WCW lived or died. So that's why so many of them didn't jump ship to WWF straight away.
And that is why the invasion angle, which we will get to, blows, but the following WF or WWE years are some pretty good television.
Oh, exactly. But it's just a sense of like, these are people that, if in order for WWF to do it, and I'll probably just mention the side of things now, in the sense that the reason why WWF were reluctant to purchase those ones because their guaranteed contracts were way in advance of some of their top stars. Like, the only people that would be comparable at this point in time would probably be the likes of Triple H, Rock, Austin, but even they probably didn't match what Hulk Hogan was making in WCW. So it's the idea of WWF would have to have purchased those contracts and renegotiated them. And it was something that they had to essentially toss up with like, whether that would make them more money in the long term, or whether it would be too much of an expense, and it would cause unrest in the dressing room because these WCW guys would want to come on similar contracts to what they were previously making. I mean, there's the famous story of the fact that when Booker T did sign his WWF contract, he came on less money than he was making in WCW.
Was he the first guy? You think he was the first guy to be like, yep, I want to go?
I think he was probably among one of the ones, because he could have he was on a bigger contract and he could have sat on his backside for the next year and a half or so, raked in the rest of the money that he wanted to. But he wanted to be in the spotlight still, because I think there's many reasons and he can only be the one that answer it, but there's probably an idea of him that he was recently established as the top guy in WCW and he wanted to continue that going forward. I mean, he gives the interview at the end of the Nitro episode, the promo, saying that he wants to be the best in the world still and he wants to continue to prove that he's the best in the world. So I think he wanted to work still, and in order to work, he would have to end his contract with WCW, because otherwise, if he worked for anywhere else while still under that contract, it would renege the contract, obviously.
Well, I think
so. He couldn't do independent dates or anything like that.
He was one of the younger guys, and he was one of the only top guys who didn't have any history with WWF. So he figured, let me try my hand in the big leagues, and he did very well for himself. Obviously, he's going to be a 2-time Hall of Famer, but there was that stigma that he did have to battle through for a while, I'd say.
Oh, every WCW superstar had to go through that for a little while. But here were some other names that were rumoured to be signed but hadn't been confirmed. Disco Inferno.
Oh, that's big leagues, baby.
Yeah. Reno, Johnny the Bull Stamboli, Jason Jett, The Wall, Lash LaRue, Kwee Wee, Jamie Noble, Evan Courageous, Kid Romeo, and Norman Smiley.
I love Norman Smiley. Kid Romeo, much like Elix Skipper, never saw him touch a WF ring. I love the name Kwee Wee. I think, I don't know.
We'll be talking about Kwee Wee when we get on to Griff. Here's some names that WWF at the time was said not to be interested in. Rick Steiner.
That was the one name when watching Greed. I said that's a damn shame that he never went.
He was seen as like a dangerous entity. He was seen as a shooter, obviously in the ring as well. But there was rumours, or at least suggestions, that he was being used in the final few weeks of WCW to rough up some people that were not like satisfied with their current situation. So essentially, he'd be putting matches with people, and he would actually beat them up in the ring. So
okay, but just imagine real quick a 2001 Rick Steiner versus a summer 2002 Kurt Angle.
Oh, it would be a very hard-fought wrestling match, but I think Rick Steiner was more trouble than he was worth at this point in time. He obviously went back to New Japan off the back of this once his contract expired.
That's fair.
Jim Duggan, Bam Bam Bigelow, Stevie Ray, Animal, Jeff Jarrett, obviously, as we'll talk about in the W Nitro thing, Rid's Man made that particularly clear. Lex Luger, Buff Bagwell, which obviously they ended up changing their mind on down the line. Dustin Rhodes, Gold Dust, which they also ended up changing their mind on a bit further down the line. Sid Vicious, Medeja, Miss Jones, David Flair, Chronic, again, changed their minds eventually, and Vampiro.
Now, of all those names you just said, the only ones that I know for sure never went, even today, are Medeja, Vampiro. Was gonna say Stevie, but Stevie's going in the Hall of Fame now. And who is Miss Jones?
She was the Cat's valet. I don't know who she. I don't know. I can't say that I remember who her actual name was or something like that. I think she was probably a Nitro girl before, like, joining up with the Cat.
But could you possibly maybe come up with a reason as to why the WWF wouldn't have wanted Lex Luger?
Yes, I can come up with many reasons, and I will discuss that. I mean, yeah, we'll come on to that in the Greed thing, because I have a bit of backstage gossip surrounding that. The names that apparently also names they were planning on turning down at this point in time were Scott Steiner, obviously former WWE champion, but has had a very questionable backstage attitude. Kevin Nash, because of his politicking and other things associated with his character, and probably the nature of him leaving the company as well. Rey Mysterio, they apparently have no interest in. Which
yeah,
apparently, well,
I mean, at that point, he probably would have just been tossed aside on Sunday Night Heat.
Oh, probably, yeah, but apparently lots of WCW personnel that come over to WWF thought that it was crazy that they weren't bringing WWF in, and they went about and said to, like, Vince and other members of the booking team that, why aren't we bringing Mysterio in? Mysterio's great. And apparently they believed that he had a bad backstage attitude. Which apparently no WCW wrestlers suggested that would be the case, but apparently he'd developed some sort of reputation.
I wonder why. He doesn't give off those vibes.
No, I don't.
Yeah,
I don't get it.
Not that I know.
They also weren't interested in bringing in Conan or Shane Douglas.
Now, on Bruce Pritchard's podcast, he claims that he got a voicemail from Conan, who just said, "Yo, Bruce, it's K-Dog. Give me a call." And because he couldn't figure out who K-Dog was, that's why Conan never ended up there. Otherwise, Conan would have definitely been in WWE, according to Bruce Pritchard on Something to Wrestle. Shane Douglas is a weird one for me, because he's a guy that I feel like if I watch him in '94, I wouldn't see why he wasn't a big star. But knowing what I know now, he kind of just comes across as big fish in a small pond.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that side of things. Then there's people with big question marks over their name. Obviously, Booker T was part of this at this point in time, but he ended up signing. The other people were Sting, DDP, who did eventually end up signing, Alex Wright, Canyon, who did also end up signing, the Cat, Ric Flair, and Bill Goldberg.
So the Cat does go, right? He goes in briefly for
2003, 2004. Yes, I know that.
Sting often says he would have gone, but there was a moment where that made him completely change his mind. And honestly, knowing the moment, and we'll talk about it at some point in the series, I don't blame him at all.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The Bill Goldberg one is the most interesting one to me, because he was on his deal remaining with WCW at this point in time was apparently he had 2.5 years left on the WCW contract, and that was earning more than $2 million a year. And when you had like Booker T wanting to take a pay cut, Bill Goldberg would not budge on a pay cut. If you wanted to bring him in, you would have to pay the contract that he was on, and maybe even more if he didn't feel like relocating or anything along those lines to accommodate more of a WWF schedule. That's just a big question to you. Do you give Goldberg the money to bring him on board?
I would have. There's so many names. Knowing what we're going to get as a quote WCW invasion, there's so many names that I just would have brought them on board, because you ended up with them anyway. The want was clearly there. You could have extended that WrestleMania 17 boom probably through to the next year and beyond if you would have just given people a good, hey, this is it. This is worlds colliding. And the funny thing about Goldberg to me is, of course, he didn't want to take a pay cut. Supposedly, the people in his ear during his rise were Hogan, Hall, and Nash, who are all very much, this is a business, brother,
Oh yeah, absolutely. So he wouldn't be taken for a ride by the company. He knew how much he would have been worth, and he was going to take that money if he could. And then obviously he eventually does come to WWE once his contract expires in 2003. But it's fair to say that his run was nowhere near the level that it could have been if he'd have come in like white hot in 2001 into a feud with someone like Stone Cold or The Rock or something like that.
Yeah, I think Goldberg hitting a spear on, a 2001 Rock or even The Undertaker would have been what a white hot feud.
So once like WCW was purchased and all of that, they essentially Turner created this brand called the Universal Wrestling Corporation, which was essentially there in place to handle all of the remaining contracts. So essentially, this was just a little division within their company which would handle all of the remaining wrestling contracts, all the rest of the stuff associated with WCW, all of that kind of thing. So that's the way of them getting around it. And then WCW officially closes its doors on, well, it doesn't close its doors, but because obviously it closes its doors on the final episode of Nitro, but it's officially purchased by WWF on March 23rd, 2001. And so ends the long history of the Jim Crockett promotions all the way into World Championship Wrestling. So you look back to like the first episode of Nitro, September 4th, 1999. Do you want to know the matches on that card?
1985.
Oh, 95, sorry. Number got wrong there. But do you remember the card for that show?
I know a good chunk of it. I know that there's the Flair and Sting match.
Mm-hmm.
There's Brian Pillman versus Jushin Thunder Liger.
Yes.
Hulk Hogan versus Bubba Rogers, right?
Yeah, Big Bubba Rogers.
And is there one more that I'm missing?
Oh no, they're the three matches, but the other big thing on that show is obviously Lex Luger makes the jump from WCW, from WWF to WCW. So, yeah, I mean, it just like that was the first kickoff of this like juggernaut that at one point in time was the biggest wrestling promotion that arguably the world has ever seen. And then it just capitulates within the space of a couple of years. It's remarkable, isn't it?
It's unbelievable when you really think about time as we know it now in the wrestling business. The span of Nitro is likely less than the span of CM Punk's pipe bomb to today, and really, it doesn't feel like too much has changed at the core. Where with WCW, you look at it, it's a completely different entity from 95 to 98, and then from 98 to 2001. It's mind-boggling to me how a brand can change so much.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So now we've discussed the death of WCW. Just like give you a chance, because obviously I wasn't watching at the time. I have memories of WCW, but they've always come post its death, so I've had to look back at the time, look back at the matches at Halloween Havoc, all the stuff along those lines, like Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero sticks playing in the mind. Like the obviously the formation of the NWO, the feud that Sting built up to 97 Starrcade, Goldberg's winning streak and the end of that streak, which we'll definitely come into maybe when we're talking about the Blame Game and stuff like that. But what are your memories of WCW from a first-hand viewer perspective?
So even though I was very young, I do have some vivid, even if they're quick, they're vivid memories of WCW. I remember watching Chris Jericho versus Nick Patrick in an arm tied behind my back match. I remember where I was when we got the WCW versus the versus NWO World Tour game on the N64 for Christmas. That was Christmas '97. So I had like vivid memories of stuff like that. I had vivid memories of watching WCW main event on like, this was the 11 p.m. on a Saturday night slot, and I would watch that. But above all else, I really, really remember Sting's entrance at Starrcade '97. I remember that so clearly, and the Let's Get Ready to Rumble and all of that. And then I also remember where I was when I watched Russo's Revenge War Games, which to me was fascinating because there's all these guys fighting in a giant cage, and this is around the time where we didn't watch WCW too much, but if you flipped over to TNT, you saw that. But of all the things that is the most vivid, this is what comes to mind. Are you familiar with the Andy Griffith Show?
I've heard of it, but I can't say that I've watched any of it.
So it's an iconic theme song, and I can't really whistle it too well, but there's an iconic whistling theme song, and I remember hearing that whistle every week in the beginning of the Thunder days, waiting for Thunder to come on. And the reason I think that this is funny is because Ted Turner always said the two things that kept my network going were Andy Griffith and professional wrestling, and that is like the weird, vivid tie-in I have, that whistling of Andy Griffith ending and then Thunder beginning. So those are kind of like my first-hand memories of WCW.
Okay, so time is here, Rob. Who is to blame for the death of WCW?
Corporate. I'm just gonna say corporate America. Like, I think the blame for the death of WCW comes on the fact that people think that they're above pro wrestling. I know you want like an answer about the product itself, and if I had to single out one person, I'm sorry, it'd likely be Vince Russo, just because, God, when he gets on a roll, it can be some hot garbage. But mostly, it's the corporate America.
I think that's probably the truth in the sense of the actual death of WCW, because WCW could have survived everything else if television executives didn't take a dim view of professional wrestling, or they looked completely at the bottom dollar. And at the end of the day, it was losing so much money that I can't blame them in too much respect. And that means that I have to point more blame to the people that were running the company during the decline. And like that, you can point to millions of mistakes that they made at this point in time. And you can point to millions of mistakes that WWE makes nowadays, but because they're the biggest deal, it doesn't really matter too much. There's nobody that can take advantage of the situation. But you can talk about the end of Goldberg's streak too soon. You can talk about like persisting with the NWO, even though it should have run for about like 2 years at most and then be killed off, because that's how wrestling angle should go. Talk about pushing people like Jeff Jarrett above their station, diluting the cruiserweight division, the terrible booking, the fucked finishes in pretty much every single main event, Turner Broadcasting just being financially inept in pretty much any way they did, and you can see with the AOL deal how badly they could handle this sort of stuff. Just the rise of WWF itself, like Austin's popularity and stuff along those lines. Like wanting to regurgitate the past, trying to work themselves into shoots, trying to be cleverer than the business. You can talk about Russo, obviously. I kind of put a lot of the blame, and maybe unfairly, on the feet of three people: Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff, because he created this incredible idea with the NWO and the idea of Nitro and all that stuff, which was revolutionary at the time, but he never evolved with it. He became complacent in my mind, and he allowed it to just continue to run and run and run, not willing to change it, because if he changed it, it could have gone wrong. But in the sense of not changing it, it went even more wrong. Hogan and Nash, Hogan because he was a very political, like the political games that he would play, the willingness to try and stay on top, the unwillingness to allow younger stars to go ahead of him in the tone pole, even though his was well past his peak. Nash, the guaranteed contracts issue. I mean, obviously it's come around today, and I think a lot of people would thank Kevin Nash for that side of things. And it's not, he's probably the least one to blame out of all of it, but he was on the booking committee. He did put himself over other people's expense. He was a political game player as well. And it was just the idea of there was a number of people just at the very top who just who wanted to get themselves over the expense of the company.
You know, if we're going to talk about it from let's look at storylines that really forced the hand here. I'm going to say that the Wolfpack should have never been a thing. I think that's where a lot of the interest goes away in WCW. That's not to say that multiple factions can't work. Like, Japan does it. You know, everybody's got a faction there. But with the Wolfpack thing, it didn't really seem like anything but a merchandise mover. Like, oh, now there's NWO Red. And I'll just say it. I think Hulk Hogan, had he been willing to step aside for a little bit, and maybe that was the plan with the whole Bash at the Beach 2000 thing, I don't know, but had he been willing to step aside or even, you know, lose to a couple of people, maybe that would have helped. I mean, if you just name a handful of people that actually were allowed to beat Hogan, they read like a who's who, even if they were only on top for a little bit, i.e. The Warrior, i.e. Goldberg. You know, they will always be iconic people, and that's because they got to beat Hulk Hogan, you know? And I think had Hogan laid down a little bit more, maybe things would have been better. And I'll also say Starrcade 97 was perfect, and the way that they immediately took it and said, no, we swerved ya, there's no champion, I think that started a lot of the diluting. Not to mention the Jay Leno matches. A lot of it to me comes down to Hulk Hogan's involvement post Starrcade. Because yeah, the end of the streak sucked, but you and we saw the end of the Undertaker streak, and I think when you have a streak, the end of it's never going to be good, because at this point, you're like, well, who is worthy? Like, who in your mind would have been worthy to defeat Goldberg?
I mean, I can't answer that question at this point in time. All I can say at that point in time, that obviously I wasn't watching it at the time, but retrospectively looking back on it, I know the beauty of hindsight and all that stuff, but it feels like it was the wrong time. It just feels like there were people that were so behind Goldberg. You should have waited until people were turning on him to get the streak ending. Like I always feel like when people talk about streaks, and I know it must be more complicated, but in my mind it just comes across so simple, with the idea of you have built someone up with the streak, they become incredibly popular because they're winning loads of matches. You give them your top title, they stay undefeated, then the crowd become resentful of the fact that they're winning all the time. They turn on people, that person turns heel, and then you get the next big babyface to beat them. It just seems so straightforward to me in my mind, but maybe it just doesn't work like that. But I don't see people use that side of things. Like with the Goldberg situation in particular, it became quite obvious that they just wanted to end it because they saw in their own mind that it was going wrong when it clearly wasn't. Or people wanted it to believe that it was going wrong when it wasn't, because that was better for them.
I think the Goldberg thing, people were starting to turn on Goldberg. It wasn't as vocal as maybe we see with the Cena today or Roman today, but people were starting to turn on him. And when you hear in theory what was supposed to happen, where it would have been, okay, you have Nash beat Goldberg, Nash gives the belt to Hogan so you can say, and all is right with the world, and you build to the next Starrcade with the idea of Goldberg's revenge, but it just never got there. But I think the main issue was, even if that would have worked, they had to draw from that same well of, oh, well, NWO and Hogan as the top heel. I think it was a matter of lack of creativity. And I know you said pushing people like Jarrett well beyond their station. But if you look at their roster at that point, Jarrett might have been one of the better options they had for a top heel. You know?
Well, I can also look at the ratings per person that the one of the Wrestling Observers March showed, and that Jeff Jarrett was drawing the lowest ratings of pretty much every top guy in WCW at that point in time. So
Yeah,
I can point to that
yeah.
as well, in the sense that they should have gone with someone different. And Jeff Jarrett was been a good upper, like he was in WWF, a good upper mid card guy, but he
You know
shouldn't have
who
been
might
world
have helped
champion as
him
many
out?
times, especially as many times as he was.
You know who might have helped him out a little bit? I know it's weird to say this in 2019, but maybe he had Benoit stayed, and they could have built around the technical prowess of a Benoit.
That's
And
what they wanted to do. I mean, he won the world championship in 2000. They were
no,
going to run with him.
They were going to do that, and then unfortunately he saw greener pastures. And luckily for those guys, that turned out to be something that the WWF ran with. Oh, the cruiserweights are the only good thing that they did, and look, we pushed them to the moon because we're smarter. But I think a guy like Benoit, and maybe even a guy like Eddie, and I don't know if it would have happened then, but had they been able to push Eddie to the levels that he would eventually go to, the talent was there, and I think it was just a matter of stubbornness. But I'll say, when you look at these final cards, they're not necessarily like, wow, what a dumpster fire of talent. There's some really big names still on these shows.
Oh, there's plenty of talent. It's talent that had been hurt over the past several years because of an insistence of pushing the status quo for too long. And these were people that kind of just felt like these are all the people that's left, even though they were extremely talented. It just felt like this is what we've got, as opposed to this is what we wanted to bring you all along.
Now, do you think that we would have inevitably seen WCW go the way of, and I hate to keep bringing them up, but like TNA, do you think that they would have just fizzled out into almost obscurity anyway?
I think they had a more established fan base. And I know the idea was that TNA was meant to capitalise on it, but every promotion that came in the wake of WCW never capitalised on that fan base because that fan base was gone. And the fan base was gone because the name went. Or the name went with WWF. So they could have harked onto their legacy and, I guess, the branding a little bit longer with themselves. I think they would have... I've always held that I think that even with all the mistakes they made, and maybe they'd have to make slightly fewer less mistakes, but if the television deal had been sorted and they had been able to find another home, then they might still be around today. But
I've often said that the Big Bang idea is one of the cooler ideas I've ever heard of, where, all of the baby faces get defeated, the company shuts down, and then all of a sudden there's this groundswell of promotion for the new era of WCW. I think that would have been really cool, and I've often felt like even WWE didn't necessarily capitalize on the fan base that they could have had with the WCW brand.
Oh, absolutely, because they had to assert their dominance, even though the war had already been won.
And
it's not enough, Rob, to defeat your enemies. It's to make sure that they stay defeated.
Now, I don't know if you want to wait till we get through the Nitro discussion to talk about this, but WrestleMania 31 with Triple H and Sting.
They were still doing it.
That was one of the most awkward stories I've ever seen play out. Like, it's fun. Don't get me wrong. It's an incredibly fun match, incredibly fun nostalgia trip, but they couldn't help themselves. And a lot of their early network programming was them just showing off, like, look at everybody we defeated. And, God, what a mistake. Can you imagine had they do separate brands anyway, had they just run WCW as a separate brand, the whole wrestling landscape might be different.
Oh, well, yeah, but it's hard to picture that history because you know who's the guy who's in charge and won the war. Like, when you put him into the equation, Vince McMahon, it's essentially, there's no other way history's going to go. So you kind of have to, for the history to change, he'd have to either completely change his mindset, or he would have had to have passed away the second that they purchased WCW. Because that's kind of, other than that, I think it was only ever going to go one way.
It's such a shame because, again, all of the legacy that really, because of the narrative that they've now pushed for almost 20 years, when you watch a WCW program, you feel like you're watching B quality stuff. Because, again, that narrative has just been force-fed that it doesn't even feel like this was a competitor. You always, at least for me, I don't want to speak for you, but at least for me, it feels like you're watching the B show.
Oh, I totally agree with it. It's the history is written by the victors. And in the sense that they obviously talk about in documentaries that WCW did take advantage, and they talk about how WCW did step it up for a little while. But then it's kind of glossed over with the talk about, the rise of Austin and the Attitude Era or DX and all this other stuff. It's like, this was a little blip for WWF, but then we rose to even greater heights than had never been seen before. So, yeah, that's the way that they frame it, and that's why most people just think of WCW as like, these were just not such a group of pretenders, but they were cool for a while, but then they sucked.
Yeah, they were like where the WWF guys went after, WWF had no use for them anymore. Blah.
It's the idea that they were a fad, when actually, in realistic terms, the real fad was professional wrestling.
That's so true.
And with the death of WCW, that fad is going to be coming to I wouldn't say abrupt end, but a very gradual, slow demise. But
yeah,
I want to lead off this discussion of WCW because I think we covered a lot of ground with this one. With the a quote from Bobby the Brain Heenan upon I think this was towards the end of WCW's life, or maybe just after it, but he said, "They always say you can't kill this business, you can only bruise it. What happened with WCW is living proof that you can kill this business when the people running it know nothing about it." And I think to draw the line under WCW and to close this chapter in 2001, because now it's pretty much WWF from here on out, going back, looking at the invasion angle and all the other side of things, I think we should cap this with a traditional 10-bell salute. And we're back. So it's obviously the big point in time here was talking about WCW's death, but we need to talk about other promotions as well, because there was a lot of other news going on in March, not just the purchase. So let's start with Shawn Michaels, a topic that obviously fills your heart with so much glee, and Tony's if he was here as well. Because we've been talking about how it was rumoured that Michaels would be returning for WrestleMania 17 in some form or fashion. Now, this is the kind of month that ends that rumour. Or at least, pretty much puts a nail in the fact that Michaels may not be around as much.
Well, I believe WWE, through documentaries, has kind of come forward to say that it wasn't a rumor, that he was coming back, and they were going to utilize him really soon. And then I think Triple H says it was while they were watching the final Nitro that Shawn, through whatever, I don't want to say drunk because it might have been something else, but he was obviously impaired when he showed up there, and he got into a big fight with Triple H, and that was kind of the end of Shawn Michaels for a good year in the WWF.
Oh yeah, there is the big story. The idea is the fact that apparently Triple H found Shawn Michaels impaired, sleeping in Vince McMahon's office, and he told Vince that Shawn was in there. Him and Shawn have well, Shawn and Vince have a falling out, and then Shawn and Triple H have a falling out, and they don't really speak to each other for the next year or so. And eventually Michaels does come back in 2002 and has the big feud with Triple H as well. So they obviously got back on the same page eventually and made up with each other. But at this point in time, it was a bit frosty due to Michaels still not being clean and he hadn't found God at this point and all that other stuff. Have you heard of this story from Chris Jericho's book, Undisputed, How to Become World Champion in 1,372 Easy Steps? He talks about the fact that, remember during his feud with William Regal, Chris Jericho dressed up as Doink the Clown?
Yes.
For an angle where, because I think in previous thing, Regal would use Doink the Clown in a previous edition of, I think it was SmackDown, whatever, maybe it was Raw, I can't remember which episode in particular, but Chris Jericho dressed up as Doink, comes to the ring and attack William Regal and humiliate him in the build-up for their Intercontinental title match. So apparently Shawn was backstage and he was in a wasted state. So this is what Jericho says in his book. So Shawn got in front of Jericho and said, "What's going on, Chris? Are you doing the Doink gimmick now?" And he said, "No, I'm just doing it for tonight. I'm ambushing Regal." And then Shawn says, "So you're going to be Doink now?" But no, I'm just doing it for one night as a way to surprise Regal. But why'd you have to be Doink? He asked, like slowly swaying back and forth. But I'm not Doink, Shawn. It's just for tonight. So he says that it felt like a bit like an Abbott and Costello sketch where one of the guys is just not getting the other thing. It's just like, and then Shawn apparently just walked away saying, like, I don't get it. Like, you're too talented to ever be made Doink. I don't believe they're doing this with you. It's like, and then apparently he was fired pretty much later on that night, according to Jericho.
Interesting to note, and I guess this kind of is the reason why, but the 2001 video game, SmackDown Just Bring It, is the only video game from like 92 to now that just doesn't feature Shawn Michaels, and I guess that's because it's the only year that Shawn wasn't under contract.
Well, there's weird things with played stories about this, because when you go on Shawn Michaels' Wikipedia page, and I know Wikipedia is obviously the way that it is, but I think it gets sometimes a bit of a bad rap, but according to his Wikipedia page, apparently he was contracted for the entirety of 2001. So I don't know whether it was a firing or he was just sent home. It's just, in Jericho's mind, it was firing, and maybe it was, but there's multiple layers to this side of thing about whether Michaels was. One thing for certain is that he just wasn't around. That's the one thing we know for certain is that he left in the build-up to WrestleMania 17 and didn't come back until 2002 with the NWO.
Now, rumored, is there anything clear on what they're going to do with Shawn?
I mean, the idea that was being pitched around is that he would be the feud that Triple H had going into WrestleMania 17, and this was in January around about that time. But before that, and like once it became clear that they were going with the Triple H Undertaker route, I think there was just an idea of just him appearing at WrestleMania 17, and then they would start an angle from there. It's not clear what the angle would be. It might have been associated with Triple H, it might have been associated with Vince McMahon, something along those lines, but it wasn't clear.
This was one of those ones that I remember hearing about early internet rumors, because my brother was the entire night talked about at some point Shawn Michaels is going to come back. Like, that was the big rumor going into WrestleMania 17. So you didn't get that, but you obviously would later on down the line.
So that's one of the big stories. Another big story, Paul Heyman starts as a commentator in WWF. So ECW, as we said earlier, isn't dead until the first week of April, but Paul Heyman starts as a writer and as a commentator with the departure of Jerry the King Lawler. We're going to get to enjoy Paul Heyman's commentary a bit more in relation to the WrestleMania 17 podcast we'll do. But what did you think, just as a general, with Paul Heyman in his role as a commentator?
I thought he was very good.
Oh, I thought he was excellent.
I thought he was different than Jerry the King Lawler, and because the King JR team ended up being so iconic, I thought that was kind of missing from WrestleMania 17. But I think, Paul Heyman is one of the best to have ever done color commentary. And really, it's a testament to Paul's ability to understand the product.
There was a bit more fallout from the Jerry Lawler quitting, so he and Stacey Carter appeared on a Memphis wrestling organization that WWF was associated with, and apparently, like, the promoter says that they'd gotten permission from the WWF they could use these two on their show, but once they had done the show, WWF pretty much severed all ties with the promotion.
That was
So it was
Power
one of the
Pro, right?
Yeah, it was so it was one of their like affiliated ones that they would use to build up younger talent and stuff like that. So just goes to show what was happening at that time. Jerry Lawler was talking about the fact that he thought that he was essentially they were out to get him for the long term, in the sense that they were just using this as an opportunity because they knew that if they fired the cat, then he would leave as well.
I mean, obviously, Jerry Lawler and the cat are still happily, I mean...
Yeah, they almost survived the rest of the year.
It's clear that as impulsive as Jerry Lawler might be, Vince McMahon can be that much more petty.
Oh, absolutely. Do you know what Lawler's idea was for the right to nudity angle that the cat was running before her departure?
No.
So essentially what his thing was, because Vince McMahon apparently was ready to end the right to censor gimmick, and so Lawler's idea for the right to nudity thing was that the cat would seduce every male member of right to censor, essentially like corrupt them due to her like sexual proclivities, and eventually she would corrupt Stephen Richards as the final pillar of cleanness and against smut. Apparently he also...
Including Ivory, or just the men?
I'm sure that Lawler would have pushed that side of things, but at the end of the day, we don't know because it never ended up happening. But apparently Lawler also eventually, at one point, pushed during the Chyna and Eddie Guerrero romance storyline that Eddie Guerrero would eventually cheat on Chyna with the cat.
And he would eventually cheat, but with just random people, right?
One of the two random people, one of the two random ones, Victoria, yeah. But it was like, it gives you the sense that maybe Jerry Lawler had some sort of voyeuristic tendencies.
Yeah.
Like he would just watch the cat doing all this stuff and seem to get some sort of enjoyment out of it.
No, Jerry Lawler's a holy person.
So yeah, that's the change in the commentary desk. Another big thing that happened this month was, we obviously talk about the Vince McMahon Playboy interview in February, and you could go back and listen to that episode because it will definitely be an eye-opener for people that aren't familiar with that interview. But he also has an interview with Bob Costas in March.
Oof.
Now, I tried my hardest to find this video clip online, and I couldn't find the whole interview. The 2001 one, at the very least. He does ones in like 2002 and 2004, which find the whole thing, but you can find the first part where he talks about the XFL. So that's the first half of the interview, because it's a 30-minute long interview. That's the first 15 minutes or so. But then the part where he talks more about the WWF side of things, where he really goes crazy at Bob Costas, is difficult to find. But do you remember anything about this?
I remember hearing about it briefly and then seeing it like later on, where he just goes off on this guy for basically calling into question the integrity of his programming, for one, and it's fun to watch Vince McMahon get rattled. We always hear so much about, you don't talk about competition and you don't this. It's very fun watching this man get rattled.
So obviously I can't direct anyone to a video clip of it, but I'll talk about Wade Keller's recap of the thing that he gives in the PW Torch of the time. So essentially, one of the big things that he takes out of it is the fact that it's very clear that Vince McMahon doesn't like to be interrupted. So essentially, every time that Bob Costas tries to intervene or talk about something, Vince would really shut him down for interrupting him. And you kind of get a sense that might be what he's like in creative meetings. So if anyone pipes up while he's talking about an idea, he'll just shut them down immediately.
I'm pretty sure they're just fired.
Oh yeah, I'd imagine so. He couldn't fire this guy, unfortunately. I'm pretty sure he would have wanted to at this point. So Costas talks about the XFL and the absolute failing ratings, as we discussed as well in the February edition. And Vince saying that he feels pretty confident that NBC will still bring it up for a second season, and there will be a second season. That confidence was utterly misplaced, but I guess he couldn't really say, "Oh yeah, this company's going to fail. Like we've completely messed this up. There's no way we're going to move forward from this." But Costas asked that would Vince go along the lines of fixing the matches to improve the ratings? And Vince obviously laughs this off, saying that's such a ridiculous statement that you can't do that like you would do with professional wrestling. It's not the idea of Costas saying that, oh, well, your other program is essentially like fixed results, so why wouldn't you fix this? And then you can get more storyline potential out of football and stuff like that. And Vince says, well, you can't do that because you can't script football because somebody has to catch the ball. Which I don't really get his argument with that sort of sense. Like, it's the idea of like, oh, someone has to catch the ball. It's like, well, yeah, but somebody has to do a certain move in wrestling, otherwise the story completely gets messed up. It's like...
But I guess, there's a lot more precision that has to take place on the throwing of a football and the catching of it. But I guess theoretically you could stage a football game.
So I want to talk about this part. So obviously, once he goes to the WWF section thing, he talks about one clip. He shows one clip in particular. Which clip do you think from March 2001 do you think he shows to try and devalue the wrestling organization or what they were doing at that point in time?
It's got to be something with Vince McMahon and Trish Stratus.
Yes, it is in particular the barking like a dog segment,
which
goes down, which is one of the most infamous, in hindsight, infamous angles in probably Raw's entire history, and that's covering a lot of ground. What is your memory of this angle?
Honestly, my memory of Vince and Trish, the one thing I remember watching on TV was Vince making out with her while Linda is in the chair and they're on the SmackDown stage. I don't remember the barking like a dog angle firsthand, but I've seen it over the years, and it's quite weird when you think about the legacy that Trish Stratus now has.
I mean, this angle came back to haunt WWE in a big way, especially with it was brought up many times during Linda McMahon's Senate campaign. There's like a sense of like this is how they treat women and stuff along those sort of lines, and Linda would have to always like defend, say that was like a thing in the past, and she ended up getting her retribution in the end. It was a character thing, and there's obviously those sort of arguments to be made, but due to the angle, TSN in Canada completely cut it out of the Raw broadcast. Sky in the UK also completely cut it out of their thing as well because it was such a controversial segment. It's the idea that apparently it turned off audiences as well. So the Wrestling Observer reports that the quarter rating before this segment on March the 5th was a 5.6, and then the quarter immediately following that was a 4.68. And that represents a loss of 90% of the audience and 1.1 million viewers from that one segment.
And I think to kind of counteract everything we were talking about with, WCW, maybe wrestling fans weren't just looking at trash TV. Maybe they wanted more wrestling, for lack of anything better to say. This... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we talk about, we'll obviously go into more detail with WrestleMania 17 when we do the review of that, but do you think what Trish did, or the way that she got retribution in the end, was worth this segment?
No, but I also don't think it was the worst thing WWE ever did.
Oh no, well, we haven't gotten to Katie Vick yet and stuff like that, so we won't cover that unless we decide to move on to 2002, but it's definitely not the worst thing they've ever did, but it's pretty seedy. And I think there was other ways you could get heat on Vince McMahon against Trish Stratus without doing that, because when you watch the segment, Vince McMahon's not getting heat out of this because the crowd are cheering him. Because
they want to. She's forcing her to strip and get on her knees, and unfortunately, they're into it. So it's not getting Vince the reaction that his character needed.
Yeah, it was quite clear that it was a case of like just titillation over really trying to build a character or trying to really build some heat on a certain character. So Vince carries on with the Costas interview. He's constantly like saying that Costas is interrupting him. Costas brings up this the Lionel Tate murder. You familiar with this?
No, I'm not.
So essentially, it was an idea of like a 14-year-old boy had been on trial for killing a 6-year-old girl in relation to, and apparently the rumor was circulating that he had used moves that he'd seen on like Raw or something along those lines. And Vince rightly, very rightly, calls him out on it by saying that that argument had been taken out of context and had been proven in the court of law during the trial that rumor or suggestion was completely false. And this is Costas' fault. I mean, you can talk about how Vince reacted to this and maybe came across as very petty and argumentative and defensive, but Costas didn't do his research properly with this one. And so it allowed Vince to show some credibility and defend his organization.
Well, thank God. You know, like, I do often feel like the media does have a tendency to attack the WWE. Like, I often think it's unfair that, you know, you brought up Linda McMahon's Senate thing. When Lance Cade passed away, they were like, well, don't you feel any sympathy for this man? And she's like, I might have met him maybe once, you know, which we know as fans to be true, but unfortunately, with a lot of the seediness that comes with pro wrestling, falls on the shoulders of Vince McMahon, whether or not the WWE partakes in any of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of like an overview of the podcast thing. Like, if I could direct you to a link to it, then I would. But it's just, you can find the first half of it, like when he talks about mainly the XFL stuff, in the on YouTube. And I think there's like a little clip towards the end of it as well that you could find. But other than that, it's easy to be lost to time. But yes, that's obviously like, this is the month where it's the big build towards WrestleMania 17. All the matches are coming together. The Triple H Undertaker stuff, the Rock Austin feud, which is obviously the hottest thing in wrestling at this point in time. You have Angle and Benoit, which is a weird situation because essentially leading into March they're both heels, but over time Chris Benoit has turned more and more babyface leading into the feud. You have you remember the Ninja Lady for
Tori,
Raven?
yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
she was revealed on an episode of Sunday Night Heat, if you can believe that.
I can, because we talked about that, I want to say on the last one, and I went in to go watch it because I didn't understand why she was just revealed, and it was just thrown away like that.
Yeah, and so essentially that was the last time that she was seen on WWF television in a like a character capacity. Like, she came back to do training for Tough Enough, so she was still employed, but and then eventually left to carry on a year as a yogi. So she does yoga instructing now.
Well, good for her. I'm sure she'll be inducted with DX in spirit.
Oh yeah. Well, speaking of DX, Chyna was apparently feeling quite disillusioned about working in the women's division and wanted to go back to working with in men's matches. And apparently, it was met with a less than receptive audience from the male superstars.
I think the ship had sailed, unfortunately, but I do think that there was some unfinished business there with Chyna, and had they capitalized, maybe we could have seen a female WWF champion, as crazy as that is to say.
The Wrestling Observer did a little piece about talking about the people that were in OVW at the time, as this was WWE's main feeder territory. They're talking about Leviathan in particular, who is of course Rob.
Big old Dave Bautista, give him what he wants.
Yeah, so I quite like that. Yeah, that's good. So they were talking about, Jim Cornette had already predicted that this guy was going to main event WrestleMania in the next few years, and he ended up main eventing WrestleMania 4 years after this in particular. So Jim Cornette clearly knows what he's talking about in certain aspects.
Well, Jim Cornette did have a bit of a hand in the next, I would say, decade of top guys with Orton, Batista, Cena, and Brock.
Oh yeah, well obviously they talk about Brock, they talk about Shelton Benjamin, they talk about Cena, talk about Randy Orton as well, doing like quite well in the build up to it. They also talk about a guy called Russ McCulloch. Do you know who Russ McCulloch is?
The name sounds familiar, but I can't say I've seen anything of him.
Oh, you have seen plenty of him. You
How
saw him
about
on
really?
SmackDown in 2004. Maybe in a match with The Undertaker from No Way Out.
Not freaking Luther Reigns.
That very same man.
Jesus.
Yeah, so they were talking about him. Apparently he had long hair at the time, and apparently people thought that he looked too much like Kevin Nash with the long hair.
So,
And
getting that generic flat top really helped.
yeah, and they also talk about Mark Henry, because Mark Henry at this point in time was retraining back in OVW, and apparently had lost quite a lot of weight from his original sexual chocolate gimmick, as opposed to the Big Show, who went down to OVW for a while and came back even fatter than he was when he left.
What's your favorite Mark Henry time frame?
Oh, the Hall of Fame stuff. That was the time they was actually utilised.
Okay, yeah, I guess I would have to agree. I also really enjoyed the Feats of Strength 2002 version.
I think they could have done more of that sort of things. Like it seemed quite. They wanted to go with that for a little bit, but then he was pretty much squashed by Brock Lesnar, and then he came back on Raw in like 2003 or something like that under Teddy Long. So I think they just didn't capitalise on that enough. It had potential, but they should have done more with it, considering the fact that he was at that point considered the world's strongest man or one of the world's strongest men.
Yeah, I agree.
They also talk about Eric Angle as well.
Yeah, that went nowhere.
Who Kurt got into the business at that point in time. But when Meltzer talks about it, he says like, and perhaps Eric Angle if he makes it. So it's quite clear that they didn't think that he had too much potential at this point in time. We talk about just a few other little bits and pieces. Michael Cole and Tazz did their first commentary together on SmackDown, obviously with the departure of Jerry Lawler, because previously it was Cole and Lawler doing commentary on SmackDown, and with him gone, Tazz was drafted in to take his place.
Now that's a big moment, because I think Cole and Tazz for many years were the definitive SmackDown guys. Like they were the voice of SmackDown.
Yeah, but well, their first episode together apparently got an awful feedback, mainly due to Tazz, not so much Cole, because Tazz was very Tazz has always been an acquired taste in terms of his commentary, but it was just a case of like he had a lot of wrestling insight, but he was a bit too. He didn't feel comfortable in the role at that point in time. He was still too much in the wrestling mindset and not so much in the commentary mindset. And to be fair, Tazz keeps wrestling until 2002. So this is still just like a temporary, like occasional thing for him. This wasn't the staple that it was in the mid to late 2002.
So, how did you feel about Tazz overall?
I mean, like I watched SmackDown primarily when I started watching wrestling in 2002, so I was mainly listening to Michael Cole and Tazz, and I thought they were fine. I thought Tazz was a bit like over the top and corny, but with his here comes the pain and all of that stuff. But yeah, I enjoyed Michael Cole much more back then than I do now.
Yeah, maybe that's because of Heyman's non-stop need for corrections.
Oh yeah, and he would go over their stuff for like hours afterwards. I probably think that they didn't appreciate Paul Heyman at this point in time, but maybe he helped out a lot more than having Vince McMahon in their ear at every moment. But and then just taking a quick short detour over to Japan for the final bit of the reheated tags. So Scott Norton won the New Japan Pro Wrestling Championship.
Hell yeah, the vicious half of WCW's Vicious and Delicious. Scott Norton, it was badass. And he's one of those guys who you won't hear a lot about, but was always one of my like sleeper favorites as a kid.
So this was like seen as a huge shock at that point in time because so he defeated I think it's Kensuke Sasaki. So essentially Kensuke Sasaki. So Norton was considered pretty much a mid-card guy at this point in time in his career, so he was just giving a shot for the championship and managed to win it in a shock. He was part of Team 2000 in WCW, which was essentially a lot of the older, more established guys, and a few who are now seen as like major veterans, but at the time were still up and comers. So it was Masahiro Chono, Scott Norton, Hiroshi Tenzan, Satoshi Kojima, and a recently debuted Scott Hall as part of the team as well. Apparently, Scott Hall went over very well during his time in Japan. Apparently, he was sober for the majority of it, so he was seen as a very like model professional at that point in time, and that was part of the reason that convinced WWE to bring him in back in 2002. So
and it's always been said when Scott Hall's sober, there's nobody better.
Yeah,
but
that's why
unfortunately he had those demons.
Well, that's why I don't lump Scott Hall in the same bracket as I would put a Hulk Hogan or Kevin Nash when we talk about like the death of WCW and stuff like that, because Hall never cared like how he was presented in wrestling. He didn't mind losing matches as long as he was getting paid. Whereas the other two were very much more considered about their positioning and how they were booked, rather than Scott Hall would say, "Oh yeah, I don't mind doing a job as long as you give me the money that I'm owed." So
yeah, which it's still a business. It's still a fair way to look at it as a business while still doing a good job that you're asked to do.
I think Scott just knew that he would kind of just be over because of who he was and his charisma, where the other two thought that they always had to be winning.
Now, if you were the size of Kevin Nash, I guess I would make a case for winning a lot if I was 7 feet tall.
Yeah, listen, I would never go with any sort of situation with the popularity and the esteem that Kevin Nash had that he should have been doing jobs every single week on Nitro. I just think that he probably could have afforded to give a little bit more than he did, especially because of the fact that he was booking the shows for a considerable amount of the period as well.
That's fair.
So, and Hogan definitely should have been doing more, and he probably shouldn't even have been around by the point that 2000, 2001 came around anyway, but he'll be around for a lot longer than that, just not in a WCW or WWF until 2002. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of the reheated tag. So after just a short intermission here, we'll move over to talking about our first show from our show reviews, and that is WCW Greed. Okay, and now we're back. WCW Greed, March 18th, 2001, the final ever WCW pay-per-view. What do you think of the Greed name, Rob?
You know, I was tempted to steal the Michael Douglas line from Wall Street and just say Greed, for lack of a better word, is good, but not in the case of this pay-per-view. I like the name. Greed is a cool name, and I think that some of the names that they used to use to tagline pay-per-views, even if they're cheesy, have more staying power than, hey guys, here comes Hell in a Cell. But Greed as a pay-per-view, maybe not so good.
So, according to Tony Giovanni in his podcast, What Happened When, he suggests that the Greed name was a byproduct of Vince Russo's idea to have a year's worth of pay-per-views being associated around the 7 deadly sins. And so Greed would be one of them, but I don't know where you would come with Gluttony and all of the other stuff. So maybe
they had WCW Sin.
Yeah, and then
they had Revenge.
Yeah, so I think and Revenge technically isn't a sin, but I guess you can just go around the sides of like evil human emotions. Maybe that could have been an idea.
But well, I guess jealousy, which may lead to vengeance. I don't know.
Yeah, you could have like Wrath. But he was obviously a former WCW superstar, so we can't really.
Well, he was a Chronic member at that point, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, he was. God, Bryan Adams.
No, Brian Clark. Bryan Adams is Crush.
Oh God, they get so confusing. Like these two. Why were these two signed by WWF?
You know, But if you think about WWE's perspective, they're looking at Crush and they're like, well, here's a former tag team champion. Here's a guy who we almost pegged to be our top babyface in '93. They were looking at big things for both of those guys, but by the time they signed them, again, maybe not so much.
I'm morbidly excited to watch their match with The Undertaker and Kane. Later on in the thing.
8-year-old me was over the moon about that match. When you look at those on paper, these four dudes going at it sounds cool.
The phrase "over the moon" means extremely.
Yep, there goes Google listening to me. But I was.
They're always listening.
About it. Yeah, that's a little scary. That I was really over the moon about it. But again, execution maybe not so great.
I'm keeping that in, by the way.
I hope you do.
A little backstage. So WCW Greed, obviously, let's say March 18th, a 0.1 buy rate. Very fitting that this was the final show. That's the equivalent of about 50,000 buys. One of their lowest in their history.
Jeez, man.
Took place from the Jacksonville Memorial Coliseum, 5,030 in attendance. So the main feud, building up to it, so the video package at the start, the main feud is DDP, is considered kind of like the last man standing against Magnificent Seven. Obviously, they'd kind of reneged on that a little bit because they'd brought Booker T back early because they were just desperate to get some more ratings in and realised how bad it was that they were losing all the baby faces and the fans were just leaving and leaving and leaving. And then Shivani says, like, during the opening segment, like, welcome to the first ever WCW Greed pay-per-view. So it's like very fitting that he just says that when it turned out to be the last pay-per-view ever.
Welcome to the last ever pay-per-view.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm really glad Shivani's back in wrestling. I think he's an underrated voice. I'm not a fan of, the other people that they had replace, Heenan and Tenay over the years. Was not a fan of Scott Hudson, and nor am I a fan of Mark Madden as the heel guy.
Oh yeah, Mark Madden was a bit too over the top. Like, he was in the way that Jerry Lawler as a heel commentator could be quite witty, even though he was quite crass in what he was saying. Mark Madden was like a sledgehammer hitting you over the head with some of the stuff that he was saying.
Yeah,
I didn't mind Scott Hudson. He was just a bit like forgettable. He just was just the voice going along. He reminds me of a lot of the commentators nowadays, where you just like try and fade him into the background.
I think maybe a few, like, if he had a couple more years under his belt, maybe he could have found his voice, but I don't think he ever found his, signature voice.
Oh, that's probably fair. Shivani also says on this podcast that apparently during most of the show, and it's quite evident in some of the matches, that crowd noise was being piped into the show because the crowd was pretty dead from about the second or third match onwards. Was just pretty much like not really that vocal until the main event. And so they were just piping noise in quite a lot during the show. Did you notice that? Did you notice it?
I didn't, I gotta be honest, but I'm not really, like, watching this show, I wasn't really paying too much attention to the sound. Like, like you said, I kind of fade the commentators into the back, much like I do today's wrestling, to be honest.
Sometimes you can't really tell, but I think it was quite obvious during the Booker T Rick Steiner match. That was the most obvious it was to me, that it was quite clear they were putting like sound into it. But we'll get to that.
Embarrassing, man. Yeah,
WWE did it as well. Like, they've done it multiple times.
They do it on pay-per-views?
They did it they haven't done it live on pay-per-views because it's very difficult. But you know the things they did with like the Roman Reigns Brock Lesnar matches where they muted the sound of the crowd to stop them, like, try and reduce the booing that was happening towards Roman Reigns. They have done this stuff. They're not above it.
I know that they've definitely done it, but I think doing it on pay-per-view just comes across as weird because, you're live and people in the audience will share that, hey, we're not freaking cheering, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but the only people that would find out about that sort of side of things would be like people that were reading the dirt sheets and stuff like that. And maybe those were the only people that were watching WCW at the time, but it's like you have to be willing to dig deeper to find that out. So why don't we move on to the first match of the card, which was A match which apparently, according to Shivani, during all the commentators during the thing, was not supposed to be scheduled for this, but it was pretty much demanded by Kiwi. It was Jason Jett versus Kiwi. I wasn't familiar with Jason Jett. Apparently he was Easy Money in ECW, and so he holds the distinction. He actually is quite a noble person when I was doing my research on him. So he's the only man to wrestle on both the final ECW and WCW pay-per-views.
What's he doing today?
Oh, that's what I was going to get to at this point. But so he was the last person ever signed to a WCW contract. So he was the last person that WCW just brought in towards the end. So he'd only been wrestling for, I think this was his first pay-per-view, definitely, but it was only his like second or third show for WCW. And then he still wrestles on the indies.
Oh, that's good.
And he actually had a match a couple of years ago with EC3 for the TNA World Heavyweight Championship in a high school.
Real?
Yeah, in a high school gymnasium.
Oh, of course, of course.
I can't remember what the promotion was. I didn't note that down, but it was just like a small time promotion that EC3 agreed to attend to and put the title on the line so he could lose to EC3. But it's good for him. I thought he looked pretty good in this match. I think both of them did. I think this was a very exciting opener.
I think he impressed me. He was one of the few people who impressed me when watching Guilty as Charged. And I also think he looked good here. And I'm going to say it again. Kiwi. And hearing you say the words, well, it wasn't going to happen, but Kiwi demanded it. It may be the funniest thing that we will ever hear on 2001 Wrestling Odyssey. Kiwi made a demand, and Kiwi's demands were adhered to.
So, Kiwi would end up like working with TNA for a little while. He played did a homosexual gimmick with Bruce. Lenny and Bruce was the tag team in TNA during their early pay-per-views.
Were they managed by Mortimer Plumtree?
I believe so, yes.
Now that's a name. I don't know where he faded into, but Mortimer Plumtree was all over early TNA, and I really remember Lenny and Bruce. And for that matter, I remember Lenny and Lodi. I think Kiwi was they were determined to get him over as an effeminate male.
Oh yeah, definitely. But apparently, well, as according to him, when he's talked about it in like more recent times, that it wasn't supposed to be a homosexual gimmick, but it clearly was supposed to be a homosexual gimmick, like the gimmick with him and Paisley.
In the same vein that Billy and Chuck wasn't supposed to be a homosexual gimmick.
Oh yeah, that was just like that was always supposed to just be two straight guys pretending they were gay for a little while. That was always the way.
Oh yeah.
The story in kind of this match is the fact that Kiwi has an alter ego called Angry Alan. I'm not making this up.
Because his real name is Alan?
Yeah, pretty much. And so essentially what would happen is that he would get mad during matches, and you can tell in this one he gets furious in certain instances with the crowd and other things that are going on. And this would be Angry Alan coming out to like cause more of a ruckus. And you can kind of tell like both of these two are like just really good solid hands, and they put together a really good match. I thought Jett like was a guy that I thought this is a guy that if he would have been wrestling that style in today's WWE, he could have been like a good person to have on NXT, maybe in like the lower card for WWE.
Yeah, I guess I could see that. I mean,
I don't want to say any further than that because he is very indie. And I know indie is kind of the thing in WWE now, but I don't think he had the kind of charisma for that side of things. Just in this match.
I just think the look of Kiwi is definitely unique, but yeah, I can see why WWE never picked him up.
Oh, I saw more. Kiwi I can kind of understand, just based on the look, and maybe they just didn't want that sort of style. But Jett I thought would have had a bit more potential, and he did get signed by WWE, and he went to a developmental territory for a year, but then he was let go. So
yeah, but then again, like we talked about, guys like Palumbo and O'Hare and all those people who, even though they made it, never really reached their full potential.
So I want to talk about this, like, cause just as a final thing with this match, because it comes like quite apparent during this entire show. When you like hit someone in the crotch during a wrestling match, do you think that's supposed to be a DQ?
Yes.
Okay, so how many times did somebody low blow somebody on this card directly in front of the referee and not get disqualified?
But you gotta understand, it was March. They're used to things being uncensored. You know, it's a different time. You can punch people in the dick. You know.
Yeah, it just like it got very, very annoying at this point in time. It's just like just explain that it's even no disqualifications in all matches or something like that. Just have some kind of explanation. But yeah, it's probably too much to ask for in a WCW show. But let's move on to the second match. The match to crown the first ever WCW Cruiserweight Tag Team Champions. Billy Kidman and Rey Mysterio against Elix Skipper and Kid Romeo.
Now, if you just hear those names, which team is winning? Just hearing the names.
Well, you would obviously want to give it to the more established team to start out with, Billy Kidman and Rey Mysterio.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%. So why didn't they win here?
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the previous one. Jett went over. Jett was the winner over Kiwi. But yeah, I mean, maybe it was just a case of like these two are established names, and they really wanted to push Skipper and Romeo. So beating these two big names straight out the gate would give them a lot of like emphasis going forward.
Yeah, and I get that, but still, to me, like Rey Mysterio and Billy Kidman should have been the Cruiserweight Tag Team Champions. They would end up being the Cruiserweight Tag Team Champions.
Yes.
So I don't get it.
I think they just saw a lot in Skipper and Romeo. Maybe it was just a case of like we give them. I mean, at this point in time, they didn't think that the company was going to end 8 days later. So
that's true.
So they probably had a bit more long term because they had a backstage segment later on after they won the titles where they seemed to be this odd, weird homosexual thing where they were just like wrapping the belts around their waist, and then they just like looked at each other and went, "Oh, bro, we don't want to touch each other there," and stuff like that, and then just move on. So I don't know whether there was some sort of thing that, but it just seemed like both in WWF and WCW at this point in time, there seemed to be this whole gimmick surrounding guys touching other guys inappropriately and things like
that. I think, unfortunately, it's playing upon the fact that professional wrestling gives off that weird vibe.
Yeah, I can't say like if I'm Darren Young watching at this point in time that I'm going to be too
eager to come out.
Yeah, exactly. You think that this is the sort of stuff that you're going to be treated to. Fortunately, things have changed a little bit more going forward, but we don't really see gimmicks like this, or at least not treated in the same way. But this match itself, this was another exciting tag team match. Skipper obviously would go on to wrestle with primarily in TNA in their X division, become a member of Triple X with Christopher Daniels and Low-Ki. He retired in 2009. Kid Romeo competed in New Japan occasionally, went to also wrestle for TNA, but funnily enough, in the time that he wrestled for TNA, he never won a televised match. He only ever won a dark match, and he wrestled for TNA on and off for about 2 years, never won a televised match.
I think that's fair. You know, it makes sense as to why I never heard of him.
Yeah, and he retired in 2008. So,
but if you look at him, he's got like the quintessential like 2000s tribal tattoo, and he looks like the kind of guy who, oh, it's funny, we'll give him a Magic Mike gimmick for like, to bring it up to today's standards. It looks like if he came into wrestling today, they'd be like, you're going to do a Magic Mike thing, and we're going to call you Kid Romeo.
Well, wouldn't you be surprised to know that he was previously a male stripper before getting into wrestling?
100%. You know what? That looks like that's exactly where they found him.
And I wonder who found him then. Maybe that's the guy that should have given the
I'm gonna guess
thing.
That was a Buff Bagwell recommendation. Just gonna guess.
But this match was a lot of fun as well. I think both Skip. Obviously, we see more of Skipper in TNA and how unbelievably athletic he can be. But Kid Romeo had a lot about him as well. I mean, it was more of a case of just being a showman and saying, "Oh, just look at my body. I'm so like hot to trot and all that sort of stuff." But he was pretty good as well. And
You know
obviously
what's
Mysterio
not,
and Kidman are great.
you know it's not good though. Mysterio without a mask.
Yeah, the half-masked entrance, and then he comes out and he's not wearing the mask. This is like we said in like the previous editions where Mysterio's wrestled. It's kind of a hard adjustment to make with when he comes back and he's masked and how much that like takes off with him. And just seeing him in the final few matches without a mask on is just it's still hard to adjust to.
You know, I mean, I'll give him credit. At least he lost the mask in a pretty high-profile match with Hall and Nash. But when I look at him without the mask, I just look at him and I'm like, this is Mysterio in his bad time. We don't touch this time with Mysterio.
Do you see like the Kidman Kazi? I didn't even realize that was the name of the move where he does the shooting star press from the top rope to the floor.
Like Kamikaze, but the Kidman Kazi.
Yeah, quite an interesting name. I don't think they ever used that in WWE because, well, to be fair, the time that he started using it in WWE, he doesn't use it very often in WWE, and probably most of the times after he uses it is after 9/11. So you probably don't want to be relating to a kamikaze or something along those lines. But it's a dangerous spot.
No, but I will say it's a better name than the 7-Year Itch, which is what it was initially called while he was in the flock.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a much better, like more catchy name. So yeah, Romeo and Skipper win. They become the first champions. After this match, we head to a backstage segment where apparently Buff Bagwell has just found his own cameraman. And he's using him to like record him as he goes back to talk to Flair and Jarrett and Animal. Just a little segment talking about how they're gonna take over everything and beat DDP at the end of the show and stuff like that. Just very generic.
Well, again, I'm surprised he didn't make it further along in the post WCW life.
Oh, we'll talk about that sort of thing. Definitely that is coming a lot further down the line. There'll be a lot to talk about Buff Bagwell around about June, July time. And there's going to be more to talk about here when we talk about their tag team match later. But next match is, I would say, one of the, if not the worst match on the entire show. Shawn Stasiak versus Bam Bam Bigelow. Stacy Keibler has aligned herself with Shawn Stasiak. And so...
Lucky man.
Oh yeah, definitely. But so she's acting like complete heel. Shawn Stasiak comes out, does a promo, which is very like generic heel, where he's handing out 8x10s of himself because he's meant to be like the reflection of perfection. I think that was his name or something along those lines.
No, you're thinking of Mark Jindrak in the WWE.
Oh yeah, that is it. But yeah, essentially it was the same gimmick, just with the same with a person who had a great body but very lacking in charisma. Bigelow comes out. Bigelow was one of the ones who, obviously, we talk about that WWE had no interest in signing, so he chose to set out the rest of his contract with Time Warner, and then he returns to the independent circuit, passes it away in 2007.
Really unfortunate end for Bam Bam Bigelow, somebody who I feel like should have been more of a player with WWE, even if it's just like, I'm not going to say even if, because when you look at the guys who were doing stuff in WWE, he could have been a player on SmackDown or even the hardcore division for however long it lasted.
WrestleMania main eventer. Always has that to his name.
He does always have that.
So Stasiak, this essential match is so boring. It's very plodding. It's very I say old school, but the worst kind of old school, where it's just Stasiak as the prissy heel runs outside when he's being attacked by Bigelow, just gets comforted by his manager Stacy, then comes back in the ring, does some really boring offense to get the advantage over Bigelow. Bigelow takes over, looks like he's about to win. Stacy gets on the apron, distracts the referee, throws some hairspray to Stasiak. Stasiak puts that into Bigelow's eyes and gets the win from a neck breaker of all things. Is his finishing maneuver. Like,
I'm sad that we're not going to talk more about WCW because I would love to talk about the angle with Stacy and David Flair and potentially Ric Flair impregnating Stacy Keibler.
Well, yeah, this is the thing coming out. We could talk slightly about like bringing Keibler and Stasiak together because the angle where Stacey comes back, she's basically rolling a pram stroller for Americans, pram for the UK listeners, where she gets in the ring and she's apparently with her baby that she'd given birth to, and then Shawn Stasiak comes out and apparently they're together, and then he pulls out the supposed baby and it's actually just 8x10 pictures of him, and then they just like and then he just write out the entire angle was just like, oh yeah, Stacey was faking the pregnancy this entire time.
Oh, no.
It's to be fair, to write off the entire pregnancy angle, it's probably a reasonably creative way of doing it.
Wow. That's another vivid memory I have. I don't remember when on Nitro, but it's where David Flair is just crazy, and the mailman comes to his house and he just goes, "You're the father! Are you the father?" And he chases the mailman down the street with a baseball bat in hand. Amazing promotion WCW was.
The DNA test on a pole match.
Oh.
Vince Russo, you wonderful human being. But then we have, after that, we have a tag team match between Lance Storm and Mike Awesome of Team Canada against Hugh Morris and Conan. So essentially, we talk a little bit about the people. So Lance Storm is one of the people picked up by WWE, and he comes in to essentially do the same gimmick he's doing, just in a slightly less featured role. Mike Awesome goes to the independent circuit after being released by WWE in 2002. So he comes part as the Invasion angle, mainly gets stuck in the hardcore division, doesn't really do too much else of note. Then he goes back to the independent circuit, retired in 2006 after the One Night Stand show in 2005, because he felt he'd been underpaid and he wasn't being utilised well. And then unfortunately commits suicide in 2007. Hugh Morris...
Was he legitimately Canadian?
I literally cannot answer that question. That would involve me clicking on Wikipedia, and I don't really have the effort to do that right now.
I'm gonna just check that out real quick.
Yeah,
because
I'll talk about the rest of them quickly. Yeah, I'll talk about the rest of them quickly. So Hugh Morris is more well known to WWE fans as Bill DeMott. Would join WWE for a little while under that gimmick, and then eventually become the head trainer of NXT for a short while before allegations of bullying and hazing people forced him to be released and let go. And Conan is still seen. He never ended up in WWE, but he was in TNA for a while as part of LAX, and now he's back in Impact Wrestling as the manager of LAX. Was in Lucha Underground for a while, Air Lucha, other promotions in Mexico, AAA.
He's currently in MLW as well.
Yeah, so he's very prominently featured in a managerial and booking capacity nowadays.
And no, Mike Awesome is very much not Canadian.
Okay, well, he was Team Canada, so he was a Canadian sympathiser. Let's call it that way, just to add a little bit of mystique to it. But
what do you think about Awesome? I thought he was really good for when he was utilized properly.
I think there's always this talk about Paul Heyman when he ran with Mike Awesome and ECW was their champion for a reasonable length of time, is that Heyman had a way of booking him which completely hid any of his weaknesses. He was just a power guy who had whose powerbomb move was seen as completely and utterly devastating, but other than that he was seen a little bit restricted. But I thought he's okay. He's not someone I can see as particularly memorable. When I think of Mike Awesome, my memory immediately shifts to the match of he had with Masato Tanaka from One Night Stand.
When I think of Mike Awesome, I think of him throwing Canyon off the top of the triple tier cage.
Oh yeah, and I also think about his debut because he won the Hardcore Championship in his debut as well.
That's right, and so he was a guy who I think may have been utilized on SmackDown or something.
Yeah, so this match wasn't. It was like an okay tag team match, but there was nothing particularly special about it. Storm is very proficient. Morris obviously knows what he's doing. Conan's just there for the hot tag. Gets cut off almost immediately doing the hot tag, and then it's another hot tag to Morris. So Storm, the finish is Storm distracts Morris going for a moonsault. Awesome gets up, hits the Awesome Bomb on Morris for the victory. It was just a bit like just there. I couldn't really say too much more about it. Do you have any more?
No.
Nah. So we'll move on past that sort of thing. So move on to a backstage segment with Dusty Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes, where Dusty has apparently ordered hundreds of burritos to eat so he can make sure that his ass is in a good enough state for when Ric Flair kisses it, that there's not that he will remember the taste of it. I guess pretty much along those lines. Very
Wow.
very sophisticated segment right there.
Very high class.
Yeah. And then we have a backstage promo with Bagwell and Rick Steiner, and then one with Palumbo and O'Haire in the build up to a tag team title match later. But nothing too much special. Then we move on to the Cruiserweight Championship match, Shane Helms versus Chavo Guerrero. So Shane Helms has got a new entrance, so he's now separated from Free Count, but he's got his own entrance, which is very similar. So he's still in, like, I guess the way I would describe it is that he's moved away from NSYNC and he's now Justin.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. How can you not say that Sugar Shane Helms is Justin Timberlake?
So this match was it was very well technically wrestled, but I think the crowd just wasn't into it. This match where it kind of feels like the earlier matches had kind of killed them a little bit, and they were finding it hard to get into this match. But in terms of like just technically wrestling, like I get the more and more I've watched these shows, the more I get appreciation for just how crisp and technically proficient Chavo Guerrero is, and what even was at this point in time.
I love Chavo up until Eddie's passing, and then everything he did just became, Eddie's moveset and stuff.
But it just felt like nothing was given any sort of reaction. Like they were hitting some really gnarly looking moves and big spots and flying crossbodies. I think if I had one issue with the way this match was laid out, is that Chavo was pretty dominant throughout the entire thing and was doing a lot of high risk stuff. And like, you're the heel. Like, surely Shane should be getting a bit more like shine on this match, especially the fact that Shane is the one that wins at the end. But they were giving Chavo quite a lot in this match.
Well, I think this is the beginning of that cruiserweight style where even the heels are going to do some awesome spots, and maybe this is just Chavo trying to establish his worthiness as a worker, maybe trying to up his stock a little bit.
Yeah, potentially. What happens at the end is that, because it's a very well wrestled match and there's a few good high spots in it, but closing sequence is that Helms reverses a vertebraker attempt into his own version, and then just gets the cruiserweight title from that. And that's probably the only real big pop in the match, is him hitting that move and getting the pinfall. But yeah, again, well wrestled, nothing too special.
I think this was very much, the people weren't ready for cruiserweights. Cruiserweights were still seen as like a dirty word, which is odd because we're only a year out from like Ring of Honor and TNA and the X Division, but cruiserweight style was still seen as very, whatever. Those are the little guys. They don't carry too much clout.
Well, I think it's slightly different in the sense that I think cruiserweight wrestling between 96 and 98 was pretty hot at this point in time, because you had people like Jericho and Guerrero and Mysterio all battling for it. I just think that Guerrero, even though he held technically pressure, I think he lacks the charisma and the personality to build himself, to build the division around. It made the division go a little bit stale.
Do you think that it's a case of the more modern fan being, like I'm talking about today's day and age, we're more accepting of new stars, whereas really, even in 2001, they just wanted to see big time players?
I think there was actually probably more of a calling in 2001 for future stars, and there's actually more a calling for nostalgia nowadays. It seems like a weird way of putting it, but it's just a case of like, I think they would have been more accepting of new stars, but I think, like I say, Guerrero just didn't have the charisma or the natural personality to really carry that division, even though he was given the ball and running with it. Like, he was having very good matches, but just it wasn't connecting with the audience as much.
That's fair.
But here's something we can talk about a little bit more in detail. Totally Buffed versus Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Haire for the Tag Team Championships. So this match goes less than a minute.
Well,
Do you want to know why it goes less than a minute?
Please, enlighten us, Callum. Why does it go less than a minute?
So, and this is again according to the Observer, but the idea was that this match would go about 7-8 minutes, with Plumbo and Hair going over. Apparently that didn't sit well with Lex Luger and Buff Bagwell, who didn't see why they were being jobbed out in this match. And they'd both been getting a little bit too big for their station. They'd be going into business for themselves in matches. Apparently, Arn Anderson was a producer of one of Lex Luger's matches in the build-up to this, and due to the fact that the match did nothing to help, I think it was either Plumbo or Hair he was wrestling, and because Luger didn't really hold up in his end of the bargain of putting the guy over or putting him over well enough, Arn Anderson, who was the producer of the match, got suspended for it. Which is quite interesting considering the fact that Arn Anderson was recently let go.
That's very topical news. Yeah.
So you get the idea of Bagwell and Luger were just upset that they had to do this thing. So essentially, in the build-up to this card, essentially they went into business themselves and talked to Plumbo and O'Hare and essentially decided to change their match on the fly. Which would be, they would go into the ring, they would cut a promo a lot longer than they needed to. Then Plumbo and O'Hare would come out, beat them up for a minute. Bagwell and Luger would do something to the sense like they both beat each other up by mistake to make it seem like they had done less damage. Like it was less the other guys doing damage to them, and it was more a case of them like causing their own demise. And then they would beat them in a minute, and then they would sell. And then you can see towards the end of it that Bagwell is grabbing hold of his neck. He's trying to play off the fact that he had a long-standing neck injury a few years ago, and so they essentially lay about in the ring for about 4 or 5 minutes towards the end of it to try and sell, quote unquote, sell the injuries, when actually what they were doing is just making a mockery of the entire situation because they were annoyed that they were losing this match.
Is Lex Luger the biggest name to just sort of flame out? Like this is his last pay-per-view match, and he just sort of goes away.
I think there's an argument for that, certainly. It's just a case of, like, he obviously he was having a lot of drug-related issues at this point in time still. It's only a few, like, months, maybe a year or so after this that Elizabeth dies.
Yes, it's about a year and a half, I think.
Yeah, so, and that sends him into his own, like, vicious spiral as well. And now he's obviously back working with WWE as part of their wellness policy. But it's just a case of, I mean, this was just a case of two guys who thought they were bigger than they were. And they were big deals. They were well-established names, but they thought that gave them the right to just do what they wanted. And it didn't help Plumbo and O'Hare in any real situation. Like, it was supposed, like, you can make the argument that having them be these two established names in such a quick way was, like, meant to put them over, like, even stronger. But there's a long sort of, like, understanding in wrestling that to really get someone over, you have to have a long match that people will remember. Whereas it's the idea that Bagwell and Luger went to this match trying to make it as short and meaningless as possible so people wouldn't remember that it happened.
And I don't think that's typical of 80s, 90s wrestling superstars. They don't want to do the job, brother, as we often hear in these interviews and such. But I don't know, I just feel like this is a weird on-screen end for the Lex Luger character.
So we move on from this to so there's obviously they sell the injuries for a little while. We have the Scott Steiner interview, so it's more of a muted Scott Steiner interview than probably what you could expect from him. But then we move on to Canyon versus Ernest the Cat Miller. Yeah,
I don't understand why the Ernest the Cat Miller is seen as like such a big baby face in this time period.
You know how he got hired by WCW?
I believe, and I could be wrong here, is he Garrett Bischoff's karate trainer?
Yes.
Ah, yeah.
Eric Bischoff just handing out jobs to all his buddies.
Wow.
So, I mean, this match is I mean, Canyon has always got this reputation as the innovator of offense. So he will essentially make it his mission that any match he goes into to do different moves every time. But sometimes you can see that as like a credible attribute. I see it as I don't know whether I see it like that as more of just a case of just stick to a style, stick to what you're good at, and move on with it. It just feels like it's overdoing it over and over again. But I guess if no one else is doing it, it sets you apart a little bit. But he was definitely the better of the two in this match.
I often thought he was pretty good. You know, like underrated to me.
Yeah, obviously Canyon would sign with WWF for a while. Would team up with DDP against the Brothers of Destruction at SummerSlam. We'll get to that obviously when we review that show. But then he would go into the wilderness for a while, and then unfortunately would be another one to commit suicide later on.
Well, there was, I believe it was in 2004, 2005-ish, he came out of the closet, announced that, you know, he was openly gay, and then I believe unfortunately, the next big news you heard from him was that he had committed suicide.
And obviously, Ernest the Cat Miller would join WWE somewhere around about 2003, 2004, originally just in like an on-screen like presenter capacity,
filler.
But, and then he wouldn't actually wrestle in his first match until 2004 in the Royal Rumble.
And I think that was his only match.
He had a match with Tajiri following that, because he wrestled at the Royal Rumble, and then he wrestled at the SmackDown Rumble that they had following it to make Eddie Guerrero the number one contender for Brock Lesnar's title, No Way Out. And then he wrestled Tajiri after that, because Tajiri during that match kicked I can't remember what his little like announcer's name was, but he kicked him in the back of the head.
Yeah, I can't remember either, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, and so they had a match with Tajiri after that, but I think that was his last match. Something like that. It was the guy that had a giant afro wig that actually was just a wig, so he was bald completely underneath it. So this match just gets towards the end, so Miss Jones, who Canyon has been stalking at this point in time, or at least been threatening, gets in the ring, kicks Canyon down, and then Cat hits the feliner, which was his just running kick for the win. Canyon attacks after the bell. Miss Jones tries to intervene, but he goes after it, and then Smooth runs down to save him. Do you know who Smooth is?
No.
So he was formerly Ice Train between 96 and 98.
Okay. Yeah, I know who Ice Train is.
And he'd been playing the Cat's limo driver since 2000. So essentially, he was coming in as like a I think he wrestled on the week before against Canyon on like an episode of Nitro or Thunder or something. But yeah, so he was coming in back as a wrestling character. He retires very soon after this. Never turns up in WWE or anything like that.
Oh, by the way, the feliner, for those not inclined, is a dollar store version of the Trouble in Paradise.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, I keep forgetting about that. It's a very, very dollar store version of that. Then we have United States Championship match, Booker T against Rick Steiner. Booker T's entrance for WCW, like, this is a company that's bleeding money, but they go all out on his entrance. He's like,
I love Booker T's entrance, mostly because he's one of the few guys that never changed. Same song, same pyro, same movements, you know?
Again, this is another match where the heel just completely and utterly dominates like 90% of this match. Like, Steiner's in control pretty much from the bell towards the end until Booker hits a spine buster. Then Shane Douglas comes out, and I didn't even know Shane Douglas was still hired by WCW at this point in time. But he comes out, he hits a cast to the back of Rick Steiner's head, then Booker T hits the bookend and gets the victory and wins the title. It was just...
Believe it or not, I think it's on one of these final episodes of Nitro that Shane Douglas was like calling out Ric Flair, and they were finally going to pull the trigger on that Ric Flair-Shane Douglas rivalry that was popular, you know, maybe half a decade previous.
Yeah, but this match in particular, like, obviously it built towards Booker winning the title and like having a nice babyface moment, which will obviously lead on to the final episode of Nitro. But this match itself, just like if you're going to put Booker over, put him over. It's just a case of like trying to keep, like I said with the Chavo match, it was a case of just trying to keep the champion looking strong, and I don't think that it felt like WWE's version of 50-50 booking, where if the guy's going to win the title, the other guy has to look completely dominant for the majority of the match.
Yeah, which it has its downfalls for sure, but I think given the talent involved, you can believe that Rick Steiner would dominate for the majority of the match, and it makes Booker T look stronger in victory.
The crowd were definitely into it, so I can't really hold out too much issue with it. But then we move on to a tag team match, which is Ric Flair and Jeff Jarrett versus Dusty and Dustin Rhodes. Did you know, Rob?
Kiss my ass match.
Oh yeah, kiss my ass stipulation. Did you know, Rob, that this was the first ever match that Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes ever had on pay-per-view?
No.
Yep.
That doesn't seem right.
They never had a match on what you would class as pay-per-view because the original Starrcade stuff was on
Closed circuit, yeah.
yeah, closed circuit television. Yeah,
Wow.
so yep, this is the first, and I would probably say, I mean, I can't remember any time that they did it in WWE, but so I might be wrong in that regard, but it might be the only match they ever had on pay-per-view.
Wow.
In 2001.
That's a shame.
So Ric Flair comes out and he's not wearing wrestling gear at all. He's wearing a Hawaiian shirt and slacks. And he says that Jarrett will wrestle both of these two on his own. Charles Robinson ends up sending, because they come out with Animal, he ends up sending Animal away, which seems quite weird because, like, in the previous history of Charles Robinson being, like, Ric Flair's chosen referee, and he's the one who's just shoving Ric Flair around saying, no, we're not doing this. Especially weird because Flair was the CEO of the company at the time. And so, and yet he couldn't call the shots in terms of referees and stuff like that.
That's lazy.
But it was, I guess it was just like another way to just generate some heel heat towards Flair and stuff like that.
And by the way, this is very depressing Ric Flair era for me.
Well, Ric Flair's wrestling with a shirt on, and we see him wrestling with a shirt on in the Nitro match as well, because at this point in time he's very self-conscious about the upper half of his body, and so he doesn't like to expose it when he ever potentially could.
That's a shame. Ric Flair should. We hear a lot about Ric Flair's self-esteem issues, and Ric Flair is one person who just never, ever should have had self-esteem issues.
Mm. So this match starts off, Dustin's doing most of the hard work for his side of the team, and then he makes the tag to Dustin with Ric Flair, and the crowd just goes crazy. And when Dusty gets in, he stumbles a little bit to getting in the ring because he's trying to hold in the burritos that he'd eaten earlier. So that's, I guess, a reasonably funny touch to add a little bit of comedy to the situation. But then once he gets to the corner and stares down Ric Flair, crowds just like lights up to see this match.
Can we shout out Jimmy Hart as, like, he did a very good job at having very rip-off themes that just made it past copyrights. With the chosen one, which was Kid Rock's Cowboy, and this, which was basically Dusty's WWF theme, but just like slight lyrical changes.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can slightly look at that sort of thing. Like, I find it very difficult to tell because obviously you're watching back on the network and stuff like that. Like, what stuff was actually a WCW theme and what stuff that WWE have just fed in because they can't get copyrighted music. I assume that was the way that it actually was, but I can never tell for certain, so I try not to bring it up.
For Dusty's theme, I know for a fact that must have been how it was, because I can't imagine WWE creating a fake Dusty theme for this. But Jarrett's theme is definitely edited out.
But so what happens towards the end is that both Flair and Jarrett go for figure fours at the same time. Both Rhodes kick it into each other, and then Dustin gets one of the worst small packages I've ever seen. I mean, you talk about Dustin in the sense of, like, this was a point in time where he was just a little bit, like, not all there. Like this is not the Goldust that came back in the like to face the Shield and fight for Cody Rhodes' honor and stuff like that. This is Black Rain Dustin, right?
Flair took a better bump when selling that he had just been defeated than he took in the entire match. Like, weird.
So what happens is that Rhodes drops his jeans to show the red underpants, and Flair just absolutely just falls over, just like so scared about this whole thing. And then I think this was one of the funny lines that I saw Scott Hudson say, because Hudson says, Flair's selling the underwear. Just like, I thought that was pretty funny. When you know it's a dying promotion, it's pretty funny.
Shame on them for just ripping off the string face gimmick.
Yes, so instead of Flair kissing the ass like it was supposed to be, they just put Jeff Jarrett in the corner, and then and it's not really a stink face, just Rhodes just rubs his ass against Jarrett's chest and face.
Cheek.
Yeah. And then so it's not really a payoff to it, but you know, just it's very I wouldn't say typical, but you know, it's like a case of, oh, we promised this thing and we're not giving it to you.
They couldn't get David Flair for this? That came in my mind.
I mean,
you know?
they probably should have done, but you know, it was just a case of, like, Jeff Jarrett was part of the Magnificent Seven. It made more sense for him to be teaming with Ric Flair there. I just don't see why Ric Flair wouldn't have agreed to it. But maybe it was just a case of, like, he knew this company was on its way out and decided he wasn't going to embarrass himself any further.
I think everything about this is wrong. Like, the finish should have came to me very simply. I know, hindsight, armchair booking here, but they both go for figure fours. Flair on Dusty, and Dusty pins Flair, small package.
Yeah, I guess they were still in the mindset at this point in time that they were pushing Dustin as the top babyface. And obviously that never really went anywhere because the company never went anywhere. But
you think DDP was stalking the Undertaker's wife throughout all this?
I mean, you have to imagine so. I mean, Canyon was busy stalking Miss Jones and stuff like that, so I guess like they were just having chats like, "Oh, who are you stalking this week?"
Yeah,
I'm stalking.
You think they traded stalker notes?
Oh, I imagine so. I mean, I try and like to think that maybe DDP like left WCW and just thought, well, what am I going to do now? Well, I guess I better start stalking some people and like having enough. That could be my new career. It's like a stalker. But yeah, I mean, we'll move on to DDP now because it's the main event with Scott Steiner against DDP for the World Heavyweight Championship. There was a nice video package just labeling DDP essentially like WWE's lost hero standing against the Magnificent Seven. They still have Michael Buffer.
I was gonna say they still could afford Michael Buffer. This is amazing. Like, good for him.
Yeah, so he's there for I guess it's fitting that he's there for the final main event of Nitro, announces Steiner and DDP. They start brawling through the crowd. I really liked this match. As just like a fierce brawl between two guys that just were willing to just put their bodies on the line a little bit and go a little bit more in the brawling hardcore style. It's nice. It was a nice change of pace to some of the other matches.
And also for me, it's wrestling that you don't see anymore.
Yeah, it's very rare you see this kind of like heated brawling style. I think like the thing that's happened most recently you could probably attracted to is like maybe the Dean Ambrose Drew McIntyre match from a recent episode of Raw. But even that doesn't go to this sort of level.
And it's because like that style doesn't exist. That, you know, trading fists doesn't exist as it did in this time.
So they have a spot where Scott Steiner takes a crutch from a plant in the audience and uses that to beat up DDP. And then DDP reverses it by the Kid throwing his other crutch to DDP so he can use that on Steiner. And then they go through the table. That was quite a nice touch. Did you see the cameo by Paul London in this?
Well, where?
He's the guy holding the sign that Scott Steiner tries to use on DDP that he rips up and takes from that fan in the audience.
That is awesome.
That is Paul London. I actually checked is that Paul London? I had to like check Paul London's Wikipedia page, and he says that his first appearance was in the crowd for this Nitro show.
That is awesome. I love that.
Okay,
yeah.
Yeah. So they both get busted open during this match. DDP obviously a lot worse towards the end of it. Crowd's playing like completely firmly behind DDP. Rick Steiner pulls the referee out when DDP had the pin following a cutter. Crowd starts chanting for Goldberg at this point in time. I assume they were chanting for Goldberg and this wasn't just piped in. If it was piped in, there's probably a really bad mistake because Goldberg wasn't turning up, so that was big.
No, they were legitimately chanting because it felt awkward.
Yeah, and Goldberg obviously doesn't come out because he's not returning at this point in time, and never will do, unfortunately. But DDP gets hit by the title belt, now bleeding a lot. Steiner first applies Boston Crab, DDP gets the ropes, applies the Steiner recliner, DDP gets the ropes. Then he hits the lead pipe across DDP's back, and then hits Steiner recliner again. DDP passes out, Steiner retains the title. I mean, it was a good, intense main event. It felt like two guys that really wanted to beat the shit out of each other. But I don't know, maybe obviously when we looked towards the final end of Nitro, it made sense to have Booker T win the 2 championships towards the end, but maybe it would have been the right decision to have DDP go over on this match.
You know what? For DDP's sake, I wish WCW would have lived.
Oh yeah, definitely for DDP's sake. Like, he was utterly wasted in WWF.
I mean, for God's sake, he was one of the legit characters of WCW, right up there with Sting and the intellectual property that was the NWO. And I really think he deserved more than the European Championship match at WrestleMania.
I mean, obviously we'll talk a bit more about when we get to the invasion stuff, but when I think about who WWF should have splashed the money on for the invasion, and obviously DDP does end up coming along, but I think because you have DDP and because you have Lance Storm and you have Booker T, the people that you could actually put in good matches and put in prominent positions, the only 2 people you really need are Goldberg and Ric Flair. Ric Flair to be the figurehead guy, and Goldberg to be like your big super main event guy. And the rest of them can come along like further down the road. But because DDP was so over, because Booker T was so over, because you had some few other like heels and baby faces that you could pull out from their side as well, it just seemed like they were just missing just a couple of key names they could have brought in.
I would have, seeing as Michaels wasn't ready to go yet, I think they could have waited on Hall and Nash. But I would have really pushed for Sting, Flair, Goldberg on top of Booker T, DDP, and then just like the other filler players could have been filler players. And then when all that is over, you can like do the NWO.
Oh yeah, if you have this sort of situation where you still having WCW and WWE feuding, and then the NWO comes in as like a third faction almost. Like someone who's there to disrupt both sides or play both sides against each other.
Yeah, because they can bridge that gap, and that's the way I would have.
And that's also well, if we go to like this major fantasy booking thing, I think that's how I would have brought Triple H back as well, as part of the NWO.
Oh, like as like the Click kind of NWO.
Yeah, you'd have Hall, Nash. You still have Hogan, but it's Hall, Nash, Hogan, Michaels, and Triple H.
And then eventually Hogan gets excommunicated. You have a red and yellow come back. There was stuff you could have done.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I think that would have been a nice way of doing it. You still have the feud going along between WCW and WWF, but now there's this other like party that's wanting to play both sides against each other and eventually take over for themselves. That would have been an interesting way of doing it, but as we find out, that's totally not the way they go about it. So, and that will be depressing to relive. But hey, this is what we're here for. So that's the end of Greed. What do you think of the show overall, as a cap off for WCW?
It wasn't a bad end, but it wasn't great either. It doesn't feel like a company that's ending just less than 2 weeks later.
No, it doesn't. I mean, for what WCW previously was, it was a signal of how far they'd fallen in certain aspects, but it felt like a company that still had some people that they could build around for the future, and had some young stars that were ready to move on up. And I guess it's for what the last show of a WCW, when you know how badly things went with WCW, it's not as bad as you'd imagine it to be. Certainly not as bad as you'd imagine it to be.
Right.
So, but now we move on from that to our second show review, which would be the last ever edition of Nitro, the simulcast with Monday Night Raw.
Did you know that went across TNN and TNN?
Wow, I know, it's amazing. I think he was missing a T on one of those.
Yes, he was.
So the first thing we see on the episode of Nitro, obviously coming from Panama City Beach, Florida, this was the 288th and final edition of Nitro, March 26th, 2001. First thing you see is Vince McMahon talking about the purchase of WCW, saying the famous line, "The fate of WCW is in my hands."
All right, you ready? I'm going to put myself out there like this. Prior to this, they had aired and I'm young enough for it at this point, so I don't want to hear any shit. They had aired a Dora the Explorer special on Nickelodeon, and then it was immediately switch over to Nitro to watch Vince McMahon open Nitro, saying, "I now own WCW."
It would have been funny to see some sort of cameo from Dora the Explorer on this. It's like,
Well, I mean, Viacom did own Dora the...
yeah, could say WCW. Is it alive or dead? Alive or dead? But I mean, Vince McMahon does do a little thing with the audience participation where he tries to get people saying like, "Oh, do you want this guy hired? Do you want this guy hired?" It's like, you could get Dora to do that.
Yeah, that would have been fantastic.
So I'll say the final
You
went
think
out.
she would have spelled double J as double G, double O, double N, double E?
I think the parents probably would complain if she was spelling things like that. So, what are you teaching my children? They don't know how to spell anything. Well, how are you supposed to be teaching them how to spell Jarrett? You will never know how to spell Jarrett.
Isn't it funny, though, that you fast forward almost 20 years, and now he's on the creative team, Jeff Jarrett, that is, and he's rumored to be rapidly approaching, great influence level?
I think we saw one of the comments in the Mega Maniacs describes it better than anything else. It's amazing how Jeff Jarrett is able to constantly fall his way upwards in the wrestling totem pole. Just like the amazing ability to make every mistake in the book and yet be rewarded for it every single turn. It's like, I'll be like one of the lowest drawing world champions in history, but I'll have my own promotion that will completely fail and lose tons of money. But then I'll get another promotion that won't even get a TV deal and like lose all the tape libraries because somebody didn't buy enough hardware space to store all this stuff. But then I'll also marry another top wrestler's wife as well, but we'll obviously work that out as well. And now I'll be working for WWF and be in the Hall of Fame, despite having screwed them out of tons of money in the past. It's like only Jeff Jarrett gets away with this, and he managed to fit being an alcoholic in all of that time as well. So it's like incredible stuff for him. But yeah, we talk about this. So Scott Hudson and Tony Schiavone are there for the final call. It's fitting that Schiavone's there for the final episode.
I think his line sticks with me the most, where it opens up and the fireworks are going off, and he says, "I have seen it, and I still cannot believe it. It's the last broadcast of World Championship Wrestling." And Schiavone really goes down with WCW. I mean, he's back now, but that's just getting started after several years away.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He mentions that this is going to be referred to as a Night of Champions, so every championship belt will be on the line.
And to be clear, that was a plan beforehand. Mm-hmm. It's just that now it was the last Nitro ever.
Yeah. So Ric Flair is out first, cutting a very impassioned promo where he talks about Vince McMahon owning the company, but he doesn't own the legacy of WCW. He doesn't own Ric Flair. He doesn't own Sting. He doesn't own all of that great stuff. I think in the Death of WCW book, they say the entire thing word for word. So I'll just read a little bit out of it just so you get context of it if you haven't watched it. But I do recommend you go watch it in the the WWE Network, because it is really like a pivotal moment in history. So he says, "Did I happen to hear Vince McMahon say he was going to hold WCW in the palm of his hands? Is that what he said? Does that mean you're going to hold Jack Briscoe, Dory Funk, Harley Race, the Road Warriors, Sting, Luger, the Steiners, Bagwell for some reason, Ric Flair, Steamboat? Does that mean you're going to hold all of us in the palm of your hands? To coin a phrase, I don't think so. So tonight, if we're going out on a high note. Stinger, the Nature Boy wants you right here." Essentially, that's build up the idea of like he wants to have a match with Sting.
You know
in the final
what?
show.
I think that's a great speech, but how the hell did Buff Bagwell's name slip in there with Luger, Briscoe, Funk, Race, all those guys?
I know, it's incredible. Did you also clock that Flair referred to himself as a 14-time world champion in this as well?
Well, we're not counting the two from WWE until we go back into WWE, isn't that why?
I guess so. I guess that's probably the argument. He goes along those sort of lines, but it's just weird because like there's it fluctuates with Flair, because you could argue that he's a 14-time world champion, a 16-time world champion, or an 18-time world champion. Like it's very he has so many title reigns across so many different promotions that it's hard to really keep track.
I think, when you get into the nitty gritty, and then one of those things are just Kevin Nash handing him the belt.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I know
maybe
certain
he's
things
not
like
a
that,
16-time world champion.
yeah. But it's also he talks about like does a bit of shooting as well, where he talks about how Vince McMahon Sr. was the one that voted for Flair to become the world champion over 20 years ago. So
I wonder if that's true.
it is.
Really?
It's that Flair was one of several names being considered to become the next NWA world champion, and Vince McMahon Sr. had a casting vote in that side of things, and he wanted to run with Ric Flair.
That's pretty cool.
And then after Flair's left and he's challenged Sting, obviously to do a repeat of the first ever Nitro show, we have a advert for Slim Jim with Randy Savage and Mental Institution.
As far as I'm concerned, that's canon.
I wouldn't be
is-
surprised. That's where he had been all this time. That's why he wasn't on this final show. He's just been locked away.
That is awesome.
Then we have the first match, which is a title unification match. Both the United States and World Heavyweight Championships are on the line. Booker T against Scott Steiner. This is like a theme throughout the entire show, that all of the matches are pretty short and just trying to get all of the big spots in very quickly. They're not really like, for a Night of Champions event, most of the matches don't feel very prestigious or given a lot of time. It just like, it's kind of not so much blink and you miss it, but it's over sooner than you'd expect it to be.
Well, because now it's all about the happy ending. It's not about anything else.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But you would have thought, because in fact these are the two biggest championships in the promotion, that they would be given the most amount of time to really work. But essentially, it just leads to Steiner tries to use the lead pipe early. Booker T gets away from it. The crowd's like really, really behind Booker T. Hits the like scissor kick, the flapjack, does the spinneroonie. Steiner reverses a bookend attempt to a Northern Light suplex, but then Booker T reverses a powerbomb attempt, because I've never ever seen Scott Steiner hit a powerbomb, and yet he goes for it in this match, and that's the thing that gets reversed into a bookend for Booker T to win. I mean, it's obviously it was all about the happy ending, like you say, but it seemed like a very muted way to end Steiner's, like, I think he'd reigned for over 200 days at this point in time, like closing in on 300 even, and it seemed like quite a muted way of doing it.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, Booker T is now a 4-time champion, and that's what people take away from it.
Yeah.
I found it weird that this opened the show.
Oh yeah, it was weird to have it, but I guess they wanted to do the Flair Sting thing for the main event, so this was a way of bookending, not even trying to do that sort of pun there, but trying to make the first match of the show and the final match of the show the most important ones.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a case of like, this is the final time we see Nadeja in a wrestling capacity as well.
Would we see her in any other capacity?
I can't answer that thing, but I'm just being certain about saying that it was the wrestling one, just because I've got no way of predicting whether she did do anything else beyond that. But it was another muted end for Scott Steiner's favourite freak.
Yeah.
Then we have like an advert for a WCW Spring Breakout by 1-800-COLLECT. I kind of think that must have been the most depressing spring break ever. It's like just a load of WCW guys like trying to, oh yeah, we'll smile and like we'll have as much fun as possible, even though our company is dying and we have no idea what the future's going to hold. Yay!
And they've got to make collect calls,
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, they definitely do now because they're not getting paid as much. Well, they're obviously getting paid on their contracts, but they may not last for too much longer. And then McMahon is backstage saying how appropriate it is that the final WCW show took place in some redneck area of Florida. I know.
Where's WrestleMania going to be held next year, Cal?
It's New York, New Jersey, I believe.
Next one.
This one, yeah. Next year it's I believe it's somewhere in Florida.
No, not that redneck area.
Yeah, it's not redneck. That's The Rock's hometown. State, yeah.
This is high class Florida.
Yeah.
It was the birthplace of Hulk Hogan, high class.
Yeah. Then we have a triple threat tag team match between Freak Out, the Young Dragons, and Filthy Animals of Billy Kidman and Rey Mysterio. This was to determine who would challenge for the Cruiserweight Tag Championship later on in the night. Again, this is just like really fast paced, trying to get all your shit in less than 5 minutes. Just diving all over the place. I was pretty hesitant when I saw Yang and what's his name? Courageous fighting again after what happened in the Super Brawl thing, because every time they got together they fucked up their spot. I think they only had like one spot together and they did it fine in this match, so that was fine. But yeah, it's just a load of people diving around all over the ring, and then Mysterio gets the guillotine leg drop on Moore to win the match. What do you think?
Good match,
Yeah, again, just very fast paced. Get it over and done with in the time they need to do, because we have to cut back because Vince McMahon is in his office with Trish Stratus. And Trish Stratus has brought him champagne to celebrate, and Vince says, well, if you really want to celebrate, they should start doing like this, and essentially starts making out with her on the couch. Because, that's more important than watching the final WCW superstars have their final hurrah.
I don't care what anyone says. I know everybody goes, oh, it's business as usual. No. I'm sure that there was a lot of celebrating, and Vince McMahon was probably as happy as a pig and shit having defeated WCW.
Well, yeah, I think you can tell with his promo towards the end of the show, but we'll get to that in a little while. First of all, we have Shane Helms defending the Cruiserweight Championship against Chavo Guerrero. Again, this was actually, I kind of almost prefer this to the match at Greed, because it was just more fast paced and getting all the big spots in, whereas the other match felt like it dragged a little bit. But yeah, it was just two guys given not much time to work with. Chavo just works around the thing, does his usual stuff, another vertebraker by Helms, and he retains. And then there's literally no time to celebrate as they just move on to another graphic.
You know what's interesting is on the other network, you've got Rock and Austin versus Taker and Kane coming up. Like, this is when you think about the annals of wrestling history, this is a big night.
Oh, absolutely. So Booker T cuts promo afterwards saying that he's ready for the next chapter and to continue to prove that he's the best in the world. Lance Storm and Mike Awesome come out for the Kane national anthem. We cut backstage where Vince and Trish are getting dressed. Michael Cole comes in for an interview, and he says fans are worried they'll never see their brand of sports entertainment again. Like, fuck off, Cole. He has to call it your brand of sports entertainment for WCW. I bet if there were any WCW fans that were thinking of turning over to WWF, they probably switched off as soon as he said that phrase.
And I know we're going to touch on it more, but again, the way they treated WCW, that kind of like, who are you promo that they would end up giving all the guys, it's like, they did kick your ass for a while.
Yeah.
Maybe not with Booker T at the top of it, but they did kick your ass.
But Rob, they won, and I need to completely reinforce the fact that they won over and over and over again. Vince asked Cole how he feels about his job security, which just makes me feel even sadder about the fact that he's still around. 18 years later.
I guess he was feeling pretty good.
Yeah. And then it cuts to Tony, who looks really miserable. Like in the announce booth, just looks like he's ready to leave and just crawl into his car and cry. Apparently, when he talks
the
about...
rumor is that Tony wanted to go back to the WWE for a while, and Vince just didn't like his style of announcing.
Yeah, well, I think apparently when he talks about this thing, he says that he had a bit of a sense of relief once he left. Like, he was quite happy that it was over because of all the pain that it caused the last couple of years with WCW going down.
Yeah.
Move on to the tag team title match. Palumbo and O'Haire defend against Team Canada, Lance Storm and Mike Awesome. Again, it's just Silvani's talks about the fact how difficult it is to stay focused with matches because of everything that's going on right now. Again, it's just another fast-paced thing. Sean O'Haire's a very good hot tag. Like, he really comes in with just like a load of fire. Palumbo gets out of the Awesome Bomb attempt, hits the jungle kick to Awesome, sent on bomb by O'Haire, and then they retain the titles. It's a good match. For what it was.
Yeah. Again, whenever I look at Palumbo, O'Haire, Jindrak, those guys, those natural born thriller guys, I can't believe they didn't go further.
Okay, then we move on to, again, the worst match on this show, Shawn Stasiak against Bam Bam Bigelow. Like, on Night of Champions, this was one of the matches they decided to put forward because they had to continue the storyline, because on the previous edition of Nitro, Bam Bam Bigelow had, in a case of real typical WWE 50-50 booking, had beat Shawn Stasiak after losing on the pay-per-view. And that the stipulation was that if Shawn Stasiak lost this match, he would get tattooed. And so Stacey comes out, teases the crowd a little bit. I basically write in my notes, I can't believe this match got on the final episode of Nitro.
I guarantee you it got on the final match of Nitro so Vince McMahon could get a good look at Stacey.
And
no,
then...
I'm not even kidding. Like, I know who went down. I believe it was Pritchard and like one of the Briscoes. I'm sure that they put this on there so Vince could get a good eye on Stacey.
I'd imagine so. I mean, he had his eyes on Trish, surely. It's the story, at least.
Why did the Shawn and Stacey show make it to WWF Raw?
They did actually. They did have Stacey managing Shawn Stasiak for a little while.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, just for a couple of weeks, and then it just moved on to her and Tori saying how much their ass and boobs were better than Trish and Leah's for the bra and panties matches. But we'll get to that when it happens.
All right, what do you prefer, meet Shawn the Star Stasiak or Planet Stasiak?
I prefer now when he's like not involved in the wrestling industry. The wrestling industry is a better place without Shawn Stasiak in it. And that sounds like harsh to say, but it's so true.
Yeah.
Bigelow comes out. He looks like an even bigger tattooed Ralphus. Like, he looks absolutely awful. Stacey, again, it's just the replay of the previous one. Stacey, just in shorter form, Stacey distracts the referee and Bigelow has to pin. She pulls Stasiak off Bigelow's shoulders, and then he hits the neck breaker, and then he just pins it. So that's, as long as this match is just over as quickly as possible, it's probably for the best, really.
Really, Bam Bam, you couldn't get up from a neck breaker? Like,
well, he didn't get over from the neck breaker in the pay per view. Why would he do it on Nitro? Surely that pay per view is where you kick out the big move, the neck breaker. You know, and it breaks your neck, Rob. It's in the name.
That's true.
Then you have Regal and Vince McMahon backstage. Regal saying that he knows how awful a place WCW is, and he questions McMahon's logic in buying it. Then we have an interview with DDP, talking about how he thanks the fans for help making WCW what it was and making him who he was. He thanks his wife Kimberly. Again, probably wouldn't be in the next couple of years or so, but it's down to him, really. And that
you think the guy who is filming this interview also filmed The Undertaker's wife?
Do you think it was Kanyon filming this interview? Like, he was on the show.
So. Well, I mean, maybe it was a pre-tape, but I just want to know was this before or after you had the cameras in Houston, Texas?
Maybe he stole this guy's camera and said, "Oh, I've got some work to do with this." Look. But then you have like a nice like not called like Night of Champions graphic showing like past WCW champions. You just get to see like a little slideshow of people like Hogan and Flair and Nash and Goldberg all holding the championship. Just a nice little addition.
I like how they just like kind of switch over to like, hey, and here's Dusty with the 10 pounds of gold, and here's the Big Show. Hey,
But then you have the Cruiserweight Tag Team title match. Did you hear what Shivani had to say about Steven Regal?
No.
In the commentary. So basically, during the entrances for I think it was for Romeo and Skipper, he said Shivani says we've had to do some crazy things in the past, Steve Regal, like putting your ass over on television. And it's just like Scott Hudson has to quickly say, "Whoa, Tony, let's concentrate on the match here." It's like Tony just let it rip for a little bit. Maybe that was part of the reason why he never got hired in WWE. But then we have just another exciting, fast-paced cruiserweight tag team match. Skipper was like really good in this match, as you'd expect him to be with the amount of talent that he had. You had this a unique-looking like electric chair bridge pin by Skipper that gets like cut off, and then Kidman hits the Kid Crusher, which is essentially like an unprettier, to win the tag titles. Just another
one at the pay-per-view.
Yeah, probably, but I guess it's a good moment to have like a title change on this one, because all the other title matches, obviously Booker T won the World Championship, but he retained his other championship, so this was the way to just get like a completely new champion on the show. So I'm not against it.
Yeah, nor am I. And like I said, I think they should have won the belt at the pay-per-view.
Yeah, but then we have a Sting promo. Sting hasn't been seen in WCW for a good number of months. So this was just him making his big comeback in the final show. So he cuts a promo about saying that he's going to do it with Flair one more time. Says everything's possible for his future. And it turned out that it wasn't WWE, but I'm sure many people hoped it would be.
The only thing... He hits you with the only thing that's for sure about Sting line, right?
Yeah. The only thing that's certain about Sting is nothing is certain.
Also, you wouldn't know it then, but don't get in the ring with Seth Rollins. I do want to point out the AOL Spring Break ad that goes before.
Is
it what a 2001 commercial? You got Super Soakers and AOL Spring Break WCW. I just love that nostalgic push.
I like the fact that they kept those in. It really gives you a sense like what certain things were happening at this point. So.
Yeah.
Then we have the main event, which is Ric Flair against Sting. Flair's wearing his robe, but he's also wearing a t-shirt underneath it. Because obviously the body conscious stuff. Sting comes out wearing the Crow get up. So it's very old school compared to the other matches, because the other matches were very fast paced and just trying to get a load of shit in a small space of time. This was just a very like old school classic. This is the typical Ric Flair Sting match that you'd take place in 11 minutes. So there's a gorilla press slam by Sting, low blow by Ric Flair to get the advantage when Charles Robinson wasn't looking. Flair's thrown off the top rope with his vintage spot where he tries to climb up to it, but Sting throws him off. He gets the figure four locked in on Sting, but Sting, like the crowd gets really behind Sting rolling over, and Sting does roll over to his stomach, and then pretty soon afterwards Sting does his no-sell of the chops and punches, launches his own comeback, which is basically just a Stinger Splash, a Superplex, and then the Scorpion Deathlock. And Flair taps out.
There's something wrong to me about Flair losing on the final WCW show, but I guess it's to Sting, so it's okay. And I guess Flair was the biggest heel in the company several days before.
Yeah. So I think it's fitting to have this be the final match and this result to be the right thing.
The final, and then he picks them right up and they go, it's sad, but I think what's making me most sad here is the state of Ric Flair. knowing that he would wrestle another 7 to 10 years, it's just like, what must he have been going through in his mind that this was the state that he was in?
I know. This is a case of like maybe he thought that this was it at this point in time. Like he didn't know if he was going to be coming back to WWF or anything along those lines. So eventually he did, obviously, and he came to work WWE and stayed there until 2008, and then obviously went to TNA for a while as well. But I think this was probably, as I said, this was a match that happened on the first ever Nitro, so it seems quite fitting. Because obviously you couldn't do Big Bubba Rogers because Big Bubba Rogers wasn't around anymore with Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan wasn't around anymore. And Brian Pillman, unfortunately, was long gone at this point in time, and Jushin Liger was in New Japan. So this was really the only thing you could do.
Well, another unnoted fact is Paul Heyman gets on to the final episode of Nitro. I'm surprised he didn't let loose. I'm like, fuck those guys.
Well, it's quite funny, isn't it? Because it's like the final two voices, commentators that you hear for WCW is Jim Ross and Paul Heyman. Two guys that had long stints in WCW.
Yeah, I think it's fair.
Yeah. I went back and watched the actual episode of Raw during this time, because it was obviously a simulcast for certain top points in it where Raw was happening at the same time Nitro was going on for the first hour or so. So McMahon opens the show on Raw basically talking about purchasing WCW again, and says in particular that Jeff Jarrett would be GOONNE gone. And then he also talks to Trish about Goldust getting breast implants, or at least pitching the idea to that. And then he uses that to segue into talking about how voluptuous Trish's breasts are, because that's what people want to see.
That's what Vince wants to see.
Oh yeah. And then we get to the final big thing, which is the big simulcast event, which is Vince McMahon cutting the promo both on Raw and on Nitro at the same time. So he comes out and crowd cheers about Vince McMahon buying Nitro. See, this is when my mind goes immediately. This is why WCW and the invasion didn't work, because the WWE fans had been conditioned to be happy that WCW died.
Yeah.
They were. Vince McMahon was trying to be as heelish as possible for this entire thing, and he gets heel heat towards the end. But when he's talking about WCW, the crowd are just going, "Oh, WCW sucked," because they were being conditioned for years to think that WCW was the enemy, that WCW was ruining WWF, that WCW sucked in every single conceivable way.
They would pop for Hulk Hogan and Goldberg, though.
Oh yeah, they'd pop for the names itself, but in terms of when you talk about the company or the brand itself, the fans were going to treat them as the heels every single way, and they treated McMahon as a conquering hero for defeating them.
Yeah.
And part of me too wants to think that maybe it was just a case of sabotaging it early. Makes me think that McMahon wanted it to feel that way. McMahon wanted to be the hero, and he wanted to come across as the big kahuna, the guy that owns wrestling now, and get that applause for it. Because we can still see it nowadays, where the people bitch and moan about how crappy the product is, how stale it is, and then Vince McMahon comes out and they're bowing to him and chanting, singing along with his entrance theme and chanting for him. It's just people are so fickle, as Daniel Bryan would say.
Yes, they are. I'm watching this promo, and what a pop that gets when he says the contract on the name reads Shane McMahon.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely get onto that side of things. But first of all, McMahon talks about how he's expecting Ted Turner to walk down the ramp at WrestleMania, hand deliver the contract to him where Vince McMahon will sign it himself.
Would have been awesome had Ted Turner been the one to kick Vince in the nuts like Linda did at WrestleMania.
He should be in the Hall of Fame, right?
He should. Absolutely.
Yeah. As should Eric Bischoff at some point as well, once it eventually happens. As much as I rag on him potentially being the death of WCW, he had a really good run as the Raw general manager, and also is the reason why WCW did get as big as it did, so he definitely deserves to go in as well.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this promo. It's sad that this was the last really good moment for the Monday Night War, and it also they never got to utilize this.
No. He polls the fans about what to do with WCW because he says that he starts mocking Hulk Hogan's poses and stuff like that. He says that he would get a lot of pleasure of just putting WCW on the shelf and then watching the old tapes over and over again on loop about how they were going to kill Vince McMahon's company, how they were going to dominate wrestling. You just watch that over and over again and laugh. And then he polls the crowd on who he should bring in. He polls the crowd on Hogan, on Lex Luger, on Buff Bagwell, Booker T, Scott Steiner. And I think Scott Steiner gets the biggest reaction out of all those names. And then he feels like he's going to stop, but then he says, like, oh, I'll give you a few more. What about Goldberg? And then Goldberg gets a huge reaction. And what about Sting? And Sting gets a huge reaction. It's just weird that so many of these people just don't end up in WWE after this. Well, they end up eventually in WWE, but they don't end up in the immediate future from it.
Yeah, I guess because maybe they thought, we'll poll the audience, we'll try to get something, but they couldn't actually get the contract signed.
Which, it's just all about the money at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's just the case they weren't willing to mess around with their pay structure to bring these top guys in. Which some people might say is fair, but, I think they would have made a lot more money if they had done.
Maybe trade in the XFL for the contracts of Goldberg, Sting, and Ric Flair.
Well, how about this, Vince? You now own like the entire wrestling organization, as it were. Why don't you pay your top guys more money? And then maybe they'll be on parity with the other top guys that you brought in.
Yeah,
maybe you could give them a little bit more money because like you own the entire thing, and maybe you could just like. It's like nowadays, like they're a monopoly on wrestling and they're making more money than they have before, and their wrestlers are still underpaid.
I think it's a fact of Vince, if you believe, again, things like the Pritchard podcast, saying, I'm not going to cower to them and pay them what WCW is paying them because that's not how business is done here, If they want to make that money, they can sit at home, but, they're not going to just make that much money and sit on their ass.
So he says eventually towards the end, he says he can't wait to. He essentially has decided that he wants to just kill WCW, and he says that he can't wait to go up to every single WCW superstar face to face and tell them that they're fired, and bury WCW once and for all. The crowd cheers to this, obviously, because they want WCW dead, and this is why the Invasion angle was the complete and total flop. Or one of many reasons.
Adding ECW to it helped at anyway.
No, but. And then he finally gets the crowd to start booing him by demanding their respects and talking about, like, beating up Shane at WrestleMania and all that side of things. And then Shane McMahon's music hits, which at this point in time was the same as Vince McMahon's music, which is a little confusing.
Yeah, confused me.
But he appears, he's not in on Raw, he's actually in Panama City for WCW Nitro. So he comes out live into a WCW ring. He says that he undercut Vince to sign the contracts and that he now owns WCW. He says, like you say, the name on the contract does read McMahon. It actually reads Shane McMahon, and the crowd goes wild, both in Panama City and on Raw. Vince McMahon's face when he hears that, the sell job from his face is just incredible.
Vince McMahon, his facial expressions, I always think of that as him saying to his roster, like, "Why can't you do this?" And really, he's fantastic as an actor. As are all of the McMahons, really. Obviously we can say what we want about them. Maybe putting a little too much stock in themselves. Okay.
Not Linda.
Fair.
Yeah.
She did great as a comatose, though.
Oh yeah, that was like the perfect role for her.
But I definitely think that, this storyline for what it was very good, and I even enjoyed when they brought it up a year and a half later when Eric Bischoff said the whole problem he had with Shane McMahon was that he was given WCW like some college graduation gift?
Yeah.
Very good.
And then Shane just caps it off by saying that he's going to kick Vince's ass, and WCW will kick Vince's ass again with him in charge. And then that was meant to be this. Obviously, leads to the match at WrestleMania 17, but it was also supposed to lead into the idea of Shane running the company and having its own promotion and its own slot on television at some point in time. But obviously, that never came to fruition, and we'll obviously delve into that into later editions. But I think it's time to draw a line under the March edition. When again, I try and keep these things short, but we get into a lot of interesting discussion. So I hope that people have stuck around to listen to it, because I think it was quite interesting. And this is arguably the most pivotal month that we're going to cover in the entire calendar.
Yeah, it's gonna become a lot of here's what's going on in the WWF in 2001 in a little bit. So
Yeah,
it's fun to talk about WCW and to be able to relive this time in the company. And I just want to reiterate that no, almost 2-3 hours later, I did not forget. Fuck Stu Snider, terrible person.
Oh yeah, fuck him. Fuck Jamie Kellner. Fuck the people that were in charge of WCW that let it fall into the situation it was at the end of 2000 and 2001. It's just a very terrible situation, and like we say, this is arguably in many people's eyes is the darkest day in professional wrestling history, the darkest month that they ever experienced, because it led to a monopoly for WWE where they could do essentially whatever they wanted because there was no other competition. And we can talk about TNA, we can talk about Ring of Honor and stuff like that, but Ring of Honor is only now just starting to reach a reasonably high level of expectations. New Japan has become bigger because of the extended globalization through the internet. TNA never ever reached its full potential, and
God, one can only hope for All Elite Wrestling.
Yeah, and that is the one thing. All Elite Wrestling, in order to at least have some modicum of success, has to learn from the mistakes of WCW. And any future wrestling promotion needs to learn from the mistakes of WCW. The fact is, TNA never learned from the mistakes of WCW. They pretty much went about committing all of them. And frankly, WWE committed a lot of the same mistakes WWE did. But they had the fortunate situation of being the only name around. So if you wanted to watch pro wrestling for a long time, you just had to go to watch WWE. It's an interesting thing. It's arguably a depressing thing. But
it's a sad end to an organization that is undoubtedly its roots are in being the A+ player in pro wrestling, but its legacy will ultimately be that of a B+ player because history is written by the victors.
Exactly. So here's where we draw the line under March and WCW in general. Every time we refer to WCW going forward, it'll be as a subsidiary of the WWF. So that's the end of WCW as we've known it in the lead up to this. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed listening to us, and we'll probably just cap it over. Just take a little bit more of your time to give a few plugs out. So obviously you can check out all the stuff that's going out on smarkoutmoment.com, all the articles. There's competition going out right now where you can win either a Triple H or Shawn Michaels Wrestlemania themed Funko Pop. So check it out over there to see if you can get your entrance in. You can also vote in the Smart Madness tournament, so voting for the top foreign objects right now. So second round voting I think is live at the moment, so feel free to check that out. Probably by the time this goes out, it will either be the second or third round of voting, but check it out either way. Get your vote in, make your choice on what the best foreign object in pro wrestling is. You obviously can join the conversation in Megamaniacs. You can follow Smark Out Moment on Facebook. You can follow Smark Out Moment on Facebook, on Twitter. Got loads of other stuff, like all the weekly articles going out. Like I do the power rankings, Rob does the triple threat. You can check out Women's Wrestling Weekly and what's the brand warfare thing? I can't remember.
Battle of the Brands.
Battle of the Brands. That's it. God, I feel so bad about this.
Cheap Pop, Cheap Heat.
Yeah, all the other weekly stuff, all the other individual articles that are coming out as well every now and again. Just feel free to check all those stuff out. Obviously check out all previous editions of 2001 A Wrestling Odyssey that took place. You can follow me on Twitter at Wigmeister14. Rob, do you want to throw your stuff out there quickly?
Yes, I would also like to say, if you want to stay up to date, make sure you hit that notification bell on YouTube and subscribe, because there's a little bit of behind-the-scenes discussion about uncertainty regarding the podcast, like the iTunes and Stitcher feed for Smark Out Moment. So make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and keeping up to date there. as all of our content drops there regularly. As for me personally, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at DudeFelice. You can check out TimekillerApparel.com, and we have a wonderful article about Charlotte Flair leading into WrestleMania, as we've covered Ric Flair a lot in this episode, and Callum did a wonderful article about why Charlotte should be in this main event going into WrestleMania 35. So check all that out on Smark Out Moment. Check out Tony's stuff at Fanboys Anonymous, at Tony Mango everywhere. And that'll do it for us. Callum?
Yeah, so just draw a line under this. Like I keep saying draw the line. Hopefully I don't have to cross the line because I'm doing any TNA recaps either. But yeah, this is again another successful edition. It was, like I said, check out previous editions. What's coming up next for 2001 is we're gonna take a little bit more of a more focused edition, because we're going to do a specific review of WrestleMania 17, because it's the biggest pay-per-view arguably of all time, and we want to give it the full recognition it deserves by having a complete show review based around that, where me, Rob, and we're pretty sure Tony will get on board with this one. So Tony, for the first time ever, will sit on the Tony panel on the opposite side of the host, which will be very exciting.
That's going to be exciting.
I'm sure he's going to give me like subtle feedback and notes as we keep going on about this, about how bad I suck at this job or whatever and stuff like that. But
it'll essentially be like working with Vince McMahon.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like he won't be able to. He'll be annoyed about being interrupted. I'll be like Bob Costas saying like, "Oh, what about this sort of thing?" He's like, "Don't interrupt me."
And because he'll kill me if I don't say it, Vince McMahon go.
God damn it. And yeah, and then we'll obviously come back with a fuller April edition where we go through the news and we talk about Backlash 2001 as well, as they take place both in the same time in April. So I thought it would be more sensible to have a full WrestleMania 17 one and then a Backlash one as part of just our overall continuing arc here. But yeah, thanks for taking this trip back in time, and this has been another Smark Out Moment, and we are being counted out.